It started with a phone call. An ordinary day in the life of Elon Musk, and yet it was anything but ordinary. As he stood on the balcony of his multi-million-dollar estate in California, sipping a cup of coffee, the sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows on the land he had worked so hard to build. Everything seemed calm, peaceful, perfect. But then came the call that would shatter that peace. "Mr. Musk, it's the fire. It's spreading fast. The wind's picking up. You need to evacuate now." The voice on the other end of the phone was frantic. Elon's heart raced as he glanced toward the distant hills. In the hazy light of the afternoon, he could already see the faint outline of smoke rising into the sky. His eyes narrowed, but his mind immediately went to work. This can't be happening, he thought. This was supposed to be a celebratory day, a milestone for one of his many projects. How quickly things could change. How fast is it moving? Elon asked, his voice steady, though a sense of urgency crept in. "It's moving faster than we anticipated. The wind's pushing it directly toward the mansion, sir. You need to move now, or it may be too late." His fingers gripped the phone tighter, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The fires in California weren't new to him. He had heard about them. Read the headlines. The way entire towns had been decimated, the way lives had been lost. But he had always been in a position to watch from the sidelines, offering support through technology, donations, and corporate partnerships. This, however, was different. This was his home, his sanctuary, his family. "What's the evacuation plan?" he asked, his mind already racing through options. "We're putting it into motion, but we need your confirmation. The fire's less than 10 miles away now. If we don't act fast, we might not make it." Elon's mind flashed to his children, his employees, his team. He couldn't bear the thought of losing everything he had worked for, everything he had built. The thought of them being trapped in a fire, helpless, was unbearable. He couldn't let that happen. "Understood. I'll be in the air within the hour," he said, his voice firm, even though his stomach churned. "Get the team ready." As he ended the call, the weight of the situation hit him all at once. His mind raced. His empire, built on innovation, ingenuity, and relentless ambition, suddenly seemed fragile. He had always believed that with enough money, enough technology, he could solve anything. But no amount of wealth could stop a wildfire. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Turning, he saw his head of security, Greg, walking briskly toward him. "Mr. Musk, the fire is approaching faster than we thought. The evacuation team's ready to go, but," Greg's voice faltered for a moment, "there's a problem." Elon raised an eyebrow. "What kind of problem?" "The roads are blocked. The nearest fire break is several miles away, and the wind's pushing the flames faster than we anticipated. We might be trapped here." Elon felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood his system. Trapped. The word echoed in his mind. Not something he ever thought he'd feel, especially not in a situation like this. He looked out over the land, his empire, the tech campuses, the sprawling estates, the laboratories, all of it. But now, it was vulnerable, just like everything else. The realization hit him hard. Technology had its limits. "Okay, we need to take immediate action," Elon said, his mind clicking into problem-solving mode. "Get the helicopters ready. I want a full assessment of the fire's path, and start coordinating with the local fire departments. I'll make calls myself if I have to." Greg nodded, already turning to make the calls. But before he could go, Elon caught his arm. "Greg, we're going to make it through this, right? We have to." Greg hesitated for a moment before offering a reassuring smile. "We'll do everything we can, sir. We've got a team of the best people on this. You're not alone." Elon nodded, the weight on his shoulders lightened just a little by Greg's words. But the truth lingered in the back of his mind. No amount of money, power, or technology can fight a fire that's out of control. As he watched Greg leave, Elon turned his gaze back toward the horizon. The fire was closer now, the smoke thicker, the wind stronger. He could see the distant glow of flames licking at the edge of the land. His heart pounded in his chest. What would happen if he lost everything? He didn't have an answer. What would you do if everything you built was suddenly at risk? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The story had just begun, and everything he had worked for was on the line. The question remained, could a man whose fortune was built on technology, innovation, and control find the strength to fight a force of nature? Could he, in this moment, call upon something deeper than money and gadgets to save what mattered most? Elon didn't know, but he was about to find out. Elon Musk had never been one to shy away from challenges. In fact, he thrived on them. From launching rockets into space to reinventing the automobile industry, he had faced adversity time and again, only to come out on top. But as he sat in the helicopter, watching the growing mass of smoke swirl ominously on the horizon, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. The fire was no longer just a distant threat. It was real, and it was coming fast. His team was in motion, coordinating evacuations, putting out small fires, and preparing for the worst. But no matter how hard they worked, there was no escaping the fact that this was a force of nature, something he couldn't control. For the first time in years, Elon felt helpless. He glanced down at the sprawling estate below, a place he had carefully crafted over the years. It wasn't just the land. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. The houses, the workshops, the laboratories, even the spaceport. Everything was tied to his identity. Everything he had built, every company he had founded, every step of innovation he had taken, had led to this place. And now it was all at risk. Elon shifted in his seat, adjusting the controls of the helicopter as the pilot expertly maneuvered them closer to the fire. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the many moments when he had felt alone, misunderstood, and driven to prove everyone wrong. That drive had carried him through countless sleepless nights and millions of dollars spent chasing ideas that others had deemed impossible. But this was different. This wasn't about building a company, breaking barriers, or reaching for the stars. This was about survival. He could already see the faint outline of his home, the mansion where he had spent so many quiet moments with his children. He hadn't seen them in days, wrapped up in the chaos of the latest venture, and now, his thoughts turned to them. Were they safe? Had they gotten out? His heart twisted at the thought of them caught in the blaze. He had always promised himself that he would protect them, be the father they needed. But what if it was too late? He tried calling his ex-wife, but there was no answer. The signal was spotty, and he was sure she was already preoccupied with the situation. Musk's relationship with his family had always been strained, the result of his single-minded pursuit of success and the sacrifices that came with it. He had missed birthdays, graduations, and anniversaries, all in the name of his companies, all in the name of his legacy. But now, as he sat in that helicopter, the weight of his own choices crushed him. All the things he had built, all the riches he had accumulated, seemed so insignificant compared to the safety and well-being of the people he loved. His children, his friends, his employees, they all mattered more now than anything else. Mr. Musk, the pilot's voice broke through his thoughts. We're approaching the area now. We'll have to land at the secondary helipad. Elon nodded, his mind still racing. He couldn't focus on the logistics right now. The fire was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. His thoughts turned back to the team of local firefighters that had been working tirelessly to contain the blaze. They were doing everything they could, but even with their best efforts, the fire was relentless. He had always believed in the power of innovation, in the idea that technology could solve any problem, but now he was faced with the humbling reality that there were things beyond his control. The fire wasn't just burning his land. It was burning the very ideals he had built his life on. He had always believed that with enough resources and determination, he could overcome any obstacle. But this was different. This wasn't about rockets, or cars, or even the future of humanity. This was about the simple, unshakable desire to protect the people he cared about, and it terrified him. As the helicopter touched down, Elon could see the smoke darkening the sky, blotting out the sun. He could hear the distant roar of the flames, the crackling of burning trees. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The fire was closing in, and time was running out. He jumped out of the helicopter, his mind still reeling. The team was already in motion, evacuating staff and securing what could be saved. Elon's mind darted from one thing to the next: how to get his family to safety, how to coordinate with the firefighters, how to make sure everyone got out alive. But as he moved, he caught sight of something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was a familiar face, someone who had worked with him for years, Jeremy, one of his engineers. Jeremy was standing near the fire break, looking as if he had just come from the front lines. His face was streaked with soot, his clothes singed, but his expression was determined. "Elon!" Jeremy shouted, running toward him. "We've got to get out of here. The fire's moving faster than we thought." Elon nodded, his heart racing. He was ready to leave, ready to do whatever it took to get his loved ones to safety. But then, something inside him clicked. He couldn't just run, not without doing everything in his power to stop the fire. "I'm not leaving," Elon said, his voice firm. "We need to fight back. I have the resources. I have the technology. We can contain this." Jeremy looked at him, concern written all over his face. "Elon, you're not thinking straight. This isn't about technology. This is about getting everyone out alive. We don't have time for gadgets or schemes. We need to go." But Elon's mind was already elsewhere. He thought about the drones, the AI, the fireproof tech that his team had developed over the years. There had to be a way to use it to help, to fight the fire, to fight for everything he had. "I'm not leaving," Elon repeated. "We're going to find a way." And just like that, the billionaire, who had always relied on his intellect, his money, and his vision, was faced with the harsh reality. No amount of money or innovation could stand in the way of nature's fury. Yet, despite it all, he couldn't bring himself to give up. The battle was just beginning. The sky, once clear and open, now felt suffocating. Dark, swirling clouds of smoke blotted out the sun, transforming the air into a choking haze. As Elon Musk stood in the midst of the chaos, a strange mix of urgency and determination filled him. The fire was no longer just an external threat. It had seeped into his mind, igniting a deeper anxiety, one that he couldn't shake. He glanced over at Jeremy, who was frantically coordinating with a group of engineers. There was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. The fire was advancing, devouring everything in its path. Yet, amidst the panic and confusion, Elon was struck by one sobering reality. Even the most advanced technology couldn't stop this force of nature. "Elon, we need to move," Jeremy yelled, his voice barely audible over the rising winds. The firebreak had held for a while, but it was beginning to falter. The firefighters were doing their best, but the blaze was unpredictable, fueled by the dry landscape and gusting winds. The devastation was already spreading beyond the point of control. Elon stood frozen for a moment, watching the fire's destructive power. He had built rockets that soared beyond Earth's atmosphere. He had created electric vehicles that were changing the world. Yet now, here he was, powerless against a wildfire. But then the thought hit him. "I can't give up. Not now." He snapped out of his stupor, rallying his thoughts into action. "I'm Elon Musk. I've faced impossible odds before. We can't just sit here," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Let's use everything we have. We need drones to monitor the fire's path and assess where we can still act. Set up communication lines to the local authorities. I'll call the state fire department and see if they've got anything we can use." He moved toward his private office in a nearby building where he could access secure communication channels. His mind raced, pulling from every lesson learned during his years of innovation and entrepreneurship. His world had always been about solving complex problems. But this was different. This wasn't about creating something new. It was about managing what already existed and fighting the very forces that nature had unleashed. As he sat at the desk and placed a call to a local fire chief, his hand trembled slightly. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so vulnerable, so out of his element. This wasn't about a breakthrough product or engineering marvel. This was about survival. His thoughts briefly flashed to his children, still in transit to a safe zone, and his gut clenched at the thought of them being caught in the inferno. "Mr. Musk, we're doing everything we can," the fire chief's voice came through the line, tight with frustration. "But this fire is unlike anything we've seen in years. We're talking about winds reaching up to 70 miles per hour. We need more hands on deck, more resources. The situation is dire. Elon closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. More hands on deck. That was exactly what he needed. More? More than his money. More than his technology. More than his connections. He needed people. He needed community. All right, Elon said, his voice steady. Get me a list of everything you need. I'll mobilize whatever I can. He slammed down the phone, the weight of the task ahead crashing into him. In a moment of realization, Elon knew this wasn't a situation where he could simply out-innovate the fire. No amount of tech wizardry could change the outcome. This was about human resolve, about people fighting together to overcome something no one could control. He walked outside, scanning the fire's advance, his mind working in overdrive. The engineers were busy deploying drones, sending them out to track the fire's movements, while others were coordinating with the firefighting teams. Every minute counted, and Elon wasn't about to let this disaster win. The wind picked up, and the air around them grew hotter. As the drones sent back their real-time images, Elon could see just how much damage had already been done. The fire had engulfed several acres of the property, its unpredictable trajectory making it seem impossible to stop. The smoke thickened, and the sky turned an eerie orange. "Mr. Musk, we need to make a call about the evacuation zone," Jeremy said, jogging up to him. "The fire's moving faster than expected. It's a matter of time before it reaches the main buildings. We're going to have to pull everyone out." Elon didn't want to hear it. His mind flashed to the control center, the labs, the spaceport. He couldn't leave it all behind, not after everything he had invested into these places. The people who worked here, the ones who believed in his vision, he couldn't ask them to leave, not when there was still hope. "Tell them to stay calm, Jeremy," Elon said, his voice hardening. "We're not evacuating until we have a solid plan. I won't let this fire take everything. We fight back." Jeremy hesitated, his face a mix of concern and disbelief. "Elon, this is bigger than any of us. You can't save everything. People come first." "I'm not talking about saving everything," Elon snapped. "I'm talking about saving the people. We have to protect them. We can rebuild the buildings. We can rebuild everything. But we can't rebuild lives." The weight of his words hung in the air. He knew that this wasn't just about the land. It was about the people, his team, his family, the community. It wasn't the first time he had faced a crisis, but it was the first time the stakes felt so personal. The tension in the air thickened as the wind howled, carrying the smell of smoke and burning wood. But amidst the rising fear and chaos, there was a glimmer of something else, something stronger, a shared resolve. "All right," Jeremy said after a long pause, nodding his understanding. "Let's get to work. We'll set up evacuation routes and start the process, but we're in this together. We'll fight to the end." As the team rallied around him, the fire continued to spread, relentless and unforgiving. But Elon could see it now. There was more to this crisis than just putting out the flames. It was about something deeper, something far more human. Hope in the face of disaster. The hours felt like days as the fire continued its relentless march. Elon's mind was operating at a pace that left little room for anything except action. It wasn't just about saving his home or his property anymore. It was about saving lives, people's lives, his employees, the families of his team, his children, and the ones who had trusted him and worked tirelessly to make his vision a reality. Despite his usual confidence in his ability to control any situation, the fire was something he couldn't direct, not with any amount of technology or money. For the first time in his life, Elon Musk felt a vulnerability he wasn't accustomed to. It was a strange sensation, being this close to the edge of losing everything he had worked so hard to build. And yet, within that vulnerability, something else began to emerge, an undeniable drive to protect and persevere. "We've got about 2 hours before it reaches the main compound," Jeremy said, his voice strained but resolute. He handed Elon a handheld radio, his expression grim. "We're in touch with the fire crews, but we need your orders on what comes next." "They're stretched thin." Elon nodded, looking at the small crowd gathered around the control center. His engineers were working with an intensity that matched his own, their faces etched with worry and determination. There was no time to waste. He could feel the heat of the flames even though they were still miles away. The air had grown thick with smoke, and the sounds of crackling trees and the roar of the fire were growing louder with every passing minute. Elon, Jeremy added, his voice quieter now. I don't think there's much we can do to stop it. It's just too big. Maybe we should start thinking about the long-term recovery. This is bigger than us. Elon's chest tightened. His gut told him that giving up wasn't an option. Not yet. He had always been the kind of person to take calculated risks, to push the boundaries of what seemed possible. To quit now would be like admitting defeat, and that was something Elon Musk simply didn't do. You're right about one thing, Elon said, his voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency. This is bigger than us, but that's exactly why we can't give up. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than all of us. But we still have a chance to make a difference. He could feel the energy shift around him. The engineers, the security team, everyone in the control room. There was something in his voice that sparked a fire of their own. The kind of fire that wasn't about destruction, but about hope. Hope that they could overcome what felt impossible. We need to get organized, start coordinating the evacuation, but at the same time, we need to keep the fire from spreading further. I'll call in some of my contacts, drones, air support, whatever we can get our hands on. We won't give up. Not yet. Elon's team nodded, their faces showing determination. Everyone knew the risks, but no one dared to show fear. Together, they set to work, mobilizing teams, communicating with local fire departments, and assessing the areas at risk. As the minutes stretched into hours, Elon watched the fire move ever closer. It wasn't just the physical danger that weighed on him. It was the emotional toll. The burning of his estate felt like a symbolic destruction of everything he had ever built. His companies, his vision, his name. Could he ever recover from something like this? Would people still look at him the same way if everything went up in smoke? His mind was filled with memories of late nights in the garage, working on early prototypes, years of testing and refining his ideas, the highs and lows of building SpaceX and Tesla from the ground up. He had been willing to lose it all before. He had risked everything to build his companies. But this was different. This was personal. The idea that he might lose it all, and more importantly, put the people who worked with him at risk, haunted him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his ex-wife, Tallulah. Elon, the kids are safe. We got out before the evacuation order came. They're with me at a safe location. I'll keep you posted. Just focus on staying safe. A small sigh of relief escaped him. His children were safe. But the weight of the situation hadn't lifted. He wasn't just fighting to save the estate. He was fighting to keep the people who believed in his vision alive. His legacy, his human connection, was at stake. The fire wasn't just burning the land. It was threatening everything he held dear. Just as he was about to make another call to the fire chief, a sudden blast of heat rushed toward him, nearly knocking him off his feet. He turned, eyes wide, as the wind shifted. The fire had changed course again. It was coming faster now, closer than anyone had anticipated. Elon's heart dropped. Get to the shelters. Now! He shouted to the engineers and staff around him. He could feel the flames licking at the edge of the compound, could hear the low rumble of the firestorm advancing. We need to move everyone immediately. Get to the safe zones. The team responded quickly, moving toward the designated shelters set up earlier, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Everyone knew time was running out. Elon ran toward the evacuation vehicles, his mind spinning. As much as he wanted to focus on the people, there was a part of him that kept returning to the tech, the systems he had designed, the drones, the satellites. He knew that if anyone could develop a solution, it was him. But with every passing second, his options were running thin. He climbed into one of the vehicles, his body tense with adrenaline. The fire roared in the distance, its flames casting a faint orange glow across the sky. Elon looked around at the faces of his team. People who had come from all corners of the world to work with him, to be a part of something bigger than themselves. They were his family, his extended team. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what was going to happen next. But he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let this fire define them. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he would fight until the very last ember. The sound of the fire was deafening. A low, ominous roar echoed through the valley, growing louder with each passing second. Elon Musk, sitting in the front seat of the evacuation vehicle, couldn't shake the weight of the situation. The fire was no longer something that could be stopped by human ingenuity. It was a beast that would consume everything in its path. The evacuation was moving quickly, but the reality of the fire's speed was setting in. They had about 30 minutes before the flames reached the outer perimeter of the compound. Elon watched as his team moved swiftly, ensuring that everyone was accounted for and ushered towards safety. The flames were close now. Too close. "We need to move everyone further east," Elon shouted to Jeremy, who was directing the evacuation. His voice was strained, but there was a sense of urgency in every word. "If we don't, the fire will trap us between the mountain ridge and the valley." Jeremy nodded, already on the phone with other staff members coordinating the escape route. The tension in the air was palpable. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what was at stake. Elon's thoughts raced. What could they do now? The fire was sweeping through the forest like a freight train, and even the most cutting-edge tech he had at his disposal seemed like a feeble match against the power of nature. Could this be the end? His mind kept circling back to the possibility that everything he had built, the companies, the advancements, the dreams, could be reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The very thought of it made him feel powerless. But even as his mind spun with doubt, a quiet, determined voice rose within him. You have to keep fighting. His own survival instincts kicked in. There was no time to dwell on loss. He had people to protect, a community that depended on him. And though the fire raged around him, Elon Musk wasn't about to go down without a fight. Keep moving, everyone. Keep pushing toward the safe zone. Elon shouted, waving to the last few members of the team to hurry. He could feel the heat of the flames now, even from a distance. His throat tightened as the air became thick with smoke. His eyes watered from the sting, but he refused to blink. The hum of helicopters could be heard overhead, but even the sight of the emergency response teams didn't reassure him. Firefighters were brave, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by the ferocity of the blaze. All Elon could do was watch, knowing he was powerless to stop the inferno that was coming closer and closer. The vehicle jolted over rocky terrain, making its way toward a nearby ridge that was supposed to be a safe zone. As they neared the top, Elon's heart sank. What they had hoped would be a place of refuge now felt like an exposed, precarious point. From here, they could see the entire scope of the disaster. The fire had consumed more than half of his property, and it was advancing, unstoppable. Is everyone accounted for? Elon asked, his voice low as he turned to Jeremy. Jeremy nodded grimly. We've got everyone out, but the fire's too close to the main roads. They've cut off access to the nearest town. If we don't get out of here soon, we'll be trapped. Elon felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The moment of truth had arrived. His mind reeled for solutions, for any possible way to fight back. Could he use Tesla's energy storage systems to create a power barrier? Maybe deploy a high-powered water system from SpaceX's rocket technology? But nothing seemed practical in the face of the reality before him. The fire was too fast, too unpredictable. What's the latest on air support? Elon demanded, trying to focus. They're coming, Jeremy responded. But they're still about 20 minutes out. We've got to hold on. The winds had shifted again, and the temperature had risen sharply. The fire was gaining strength, burning hotter and faster. Elon stood, staring at the growing inferno in the distance, his mind a blur of frustration. There had to be something he could do, something more. Then it hit him. What if they could create their own barrier, a fire break wide enough to slow the fire's progress? Elon, we need to make a decision, and we need to make it fast, Jeremy said, his voice urgent. We can either wait for the air support to arrive and hope it holds off the fire, or we start making a stand right now. Elon felt the weight of the decision settle on him like a mountain. He could wait and hope for the best, or he could act. Let's move, Elon said, his voice firm. Start digging up everything we can. Shovels, tractors, anything. We'll clear a fire break. We can't rely on anyone else. If we're going to survive this, we do it ourselves." Within moments, his team mobilized. Elon wasn't used to being in the trenches like this. He had always relied on his engineers, his scientists, his teams of professionals. But this wasn't about technology. This was about sheer will and grit, about showing his people that they could fight back. They worked frantically, clearing a wide path around the ridge. The fire was closing in, the heat and smoke unbearable. But every shovel of dirt, every tractor tire that dug into the soil, was one more step closer to survival. As the first helicopter arrived, water cannons blasting the approaching flames, Elon took a deep breath, the air thick and stifling. His heart pounded in his chest. They had done everything they could. Now, it was up to nature. But just when it seemed like they might have a fighting chance, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the valley, sending the flames racing forward. The helicopter's water drop was too late. The fire surged forward like an unstoppable beast, roaring in the distance, consuming everything in its path. Elon's heart dropped as he saw the fire leap over the makeshift barrier they had worked so hard to build. "No, no!" he shouted. His voice strained as the flames reached the ridge. The roar of the fire was deafening now. He watched as the fire, faster and hotter than anything he had anticipated, tore through the gap. His team scattered as the fire advanced, and he could feel the heat intensify even from where they stood. The dream, his legacy, the work of years, it was all slipping away in the blink of an eye. For a brief, painful moment, Elon felt defeated. His mind raced through the worst-case scenarios, and then, at that instant, he remembered the thing that had always kept him going in the darkest moments: the fight. This was not the end. Not yet. Keep moving. Head east, toward the second shelter. We're not finished yet. Elon yelled, forcing the resolve back into his voice. There was no time for despair. If they were going to survive, they had to move, and they had to move fast. The relentless roar of the fire consumed everything around them. It was impossible to tell whether the smoke clouding the air was more terrifying than the growing inferno itself. Elon Musk could feel his heart racing as he led the remaining survivors eastward, their steps heavy with exhaustion and fear. The path ahead seemed uncertain, but there was no choice but to keep moving. Behind them, the flames crackled and snapped, like the snapping jaws of a wild animal, and the heat intensified with every passing second. Elon's thoughts swirled in chaos. Was it too late? Could they still find a way out? He pushed the doubt aside, focusing on the survival of his people. The fire might have taken so much, but it hadn't taken their will to fight. That, he still had control over. "Keep going. We're almost there," Elon shouted, his voice raw from the heat and smoke, but unwavering. He glanced over his shoulder at the team trailing behind. Each of them was exhausted, but their determination was still strong. They were fighting for more than just their lives. They were fighting for their future, for everything they had worked for. Jeremy was right beside him, leading another group of engineers who had volunteered to help. His eyes were wild with urgency, sweat beading down his face, but his jaw was clenched with determination. "Elon, we're going to need to keep moving. That fire's gaining on us," Jeremy said, breathing heavily. "We've cleared the best path we could, but it's still too close. If the winds shift, we're looking at another evacuation scenario." Elon nodded grimly. There was little time to waste. The fire's progress had slowed, but not by much. Even as they reached the secondary shelter, where they could begin to regroup, the heat continued to crawl in their direction. The distant glow of flames could still be seen, towering above the ridgeline like a great beast on the prowl. He approached the shelter with a sense of urgency, but as soon as they reached the entrance, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Elon, thank God you're here." Elon turned, surprised to see several members of his team who had already made it to the shelter. One of them was Melanie, a senior engineer at SpaceX. She had been with him from the beginning, and he could see the relief on her face as she approached him. "We've got communications back," Melanie said, holding out a small satellite phone. "The air support's coming in, and I've connected with emergency teams in the area. They're ready to help with rescue and recovery. I know it's still a mess, but we've got a shot." For the first time in hours, a small flicker of hope kindled in Elon's chest. They had a shot. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. Elon, Melanie continued, her voice quieter now. The fire's still a threat. We need to think about long-term evacuation. We can't keep running forever. If this doesn't get contained soon, we'll be forced to make the call on whether to stay or leave altogether. Elon's gaze hardened, his mind working quickly. A part of him wanted to focus on the fact that they had survived this far, that the fight wasn't over. But Melanie's words echoed in his ears. The reality was unavoidable. The fire wasn't slowing down. And with the air support still a distance away, they might not have the luxury of time to wait for outside help. What's the status of the drones? Elon asked, turning to Jeremy. Can we get more eyes on the fire's progression? We need a clearer picture. I can't make a decision without knowing where that fire's headed next. We've got some drones still operational, Jeremy said, pulling out a tablet and typing rapidly. But they're running low on power. I'll see if I can coordinate with a few more satellites to get real-time data. But it's a gamble. We'll take the gamble, Elon replied, stepping back to the shelter entrance and looking out toward the advancing flames. The air was thick with smoke, the fire's oppressive heat reaching even here. His mind raced, focusing on the next steps. It wasn't enough to merely survive anymore. He needed to act. He needed to keep his team alive and get them to safety, but he also needed to do more. He had to find a way to fight back. If anyone could turn the tide in this situation, it was him. The sudden crackle of his radio interrupted his thoughts. He grabbed it swiftly, hoping for good news. Elon, a voice crackled over the line. This is the fire chief. We've got more units moving in. We're also calling in additional aerial support. But I have to be straight with you. If the wind keeps up, the fire could breach the area you're in. We're going to need you to make the call on whether you stay or evacuate the shelter. Elon's stomach twisted. This was the moment. This wasn't just about survival. It was about leadership, about making the hard decisions that could save lives or risk everything. We're holding here for now, Elon said, his voice clear and decisive. Keep the air support on standby and keep moving in reinforcements. We'll manage until then. He turned back to Melanie and Jeremy. Prepare the teams. Get everyone ready for whatever happens next. We can't afford to let this fire catch us off guard. As his team moved to set up additional safety measures within the shelter, Elon took a step back, letting the weight of everything settle over him. This wasn't just a physical battle anymore. It was a mental one. A battle of resilience. Every ounce of his being was focused on survival. Not just for himself, but for the people who had believed in his vision, the people who had fought beside him through thick and thin. The hours passed slowly, and the smoke thickened. As the fire encroached upon the area, the tension was palpable. But even as the inferno crept closer, Elon could feel something stirring deep within him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. A fierce determination to fight back. The moment of truth was drawing near, but he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The fire was unrelenting. It had spread faster than anyone anticipated, and even with every effort to contain it, the flames continued to creep closer, lapping at the very edges of the compound. Elon Musk stood with his arms crossed, staring out into the distance. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations, decisions, and strategies. He couldn't afford to make a single wrong move. The air had become stifling, thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. His lungs burned with every breath, but he didn't dare show weakness. Not here, not now. The shelter, hastily set up in the clearing, had become a temporary haven. But how long would it last? How long could they hold out before the fire consumed everything? He turned back toward the shelter, where his team had gathered. They were tired, some of them covered in soot and ash, their eyes hollow from the sleepless hours. Yet, despite the exhaustion, there was still a quiet strength among them. It was that same strength that had driven Elon to take risks, to pursue ambitious goals, and to lead people toward the impossible. Elon, Jeremy said, stepping up beside him, the drones are reporting back. The fire's advanced too far in the west to turn back now. If we're going to stay, we need to get people into the secondary shelter before we lose power. It's only a matter of time before we're cut off from the outside. Elon's jaw tightened. There was no simple answer. They couldn't stay here, not with the fire closing in. But evacuating would mean abandoning everything. The estate, the technology, the very work he had spent years building. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was immense. "What's the status on the air support?" Elon asked, his voice cool despite the chaos surrounding them. "They're still on their way," Jeremy replied. "But they'll be too late to make a significant difference. We've got to make the call now. The team can't keep moving forward like this indefinitely." Elon ran a hand through his hair, looking out at the smoke-filled sky. It was as though the world itself was suffocating under the weight of the flames. His thoughts flickered back to his early days in business. The sleepless nights, the constant struggle to prove that his ideas were viable. How many times had he faced seemingly insurmountable odds before? How many times had people told him he couldn't do something, only for him to push forward and prove them wrong? But this was different. This wasn't just about technology or innovation. This was life and death. The stakes had never been higher. "All right," Elon said finally, his voice hardening with resolve. "We'll move out. Everyone, gather up. We're going to set up in the secondary shelter and then reevaluate. If the fire's still pushing toward us, we'll find a way to push back. We don't stop until we've exhausted every option." Jeremy nodded, his face a mixture of relief and fear. The team had been waiting for direction, and now they had it. But even as they began to move, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of fear in the air. They knew the reality. Time was running out. As they gathered their belongings, Elon couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision he had just made. Was it the right one? Would they make it out alive? Every step he took away from the main compound felt like he was abandoning a piece of himself. His legacy was being reduced to ash in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The walk to the secondary shelter was long and grueling. The air grew thicker with smoke, and the once clear skies were now an oppressive, dark orange. They moved in silence. The only sounds were the crackling of nearby fires and the occasional coughing of a team member who couldn't escape the thick air. When they finally reached the shelter, it was already in use. The secondary location was far enough from the fire's immediate path, but Elon knew it wouldn't be enough to keep everyone safe for long. They needed more. They needed to fight back. "Elon, we've got a problem," Melanie said, pulling him aside as the team settled into the shelter. "The fire's jumping from tree to tree. It's moving faster than we can keep up with. I don't think we'll be able to keep outrunning it." He looked at her, his mind racing. They had tried everything, yet nothing seemed to be working. The fire was an unstoppable force of nature, and no amount of technology or human effort seemed to make a dent. "Where's the nearest evacuation point?" Elon asked, knowing the answer already, even before Melanie spoke. "It's over 20 miles, she replied. "And that's if the roads stay clear. The fire's already destroyed parts of the route." Elon's heart sank. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. They were running out of options. If they couldn't stop the fire or escape soon, they would be trapped. The intensity of the situation was overwhelming. The fire, the evacuation, the worry for his people. It was all mounting. But Elon couldn't afford to let panic take over. He couldn't afford to be like everyone else, lost in uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, Elon stood up straighter, his thoughts snapping into focus. "We're not done yet," he said firmly, addressing his team, who had gathered inside the shelter, some of them looking worn down, others still trying to mask their fear. "We fight. We adapt. We find a way out together. We've made it this far, and we're not stopping now." The words were simple, but they held the weight of his years of experience, of the battles he had fought, the companies he had built, the failures he had overcome. This was just another challenge, just another obstacle to push through. He had been to the edge of ruin before. He had stared down impossible odds, but he always found a way forward, and he would do it again. "Elon," Jeremy said, stepping forward, "we've got one last chance. There's a ridge north of here, and if we can get enough equipment and personnel up there, we might be able to create a barrier strong enough to slow the fire down long enough for us to get to the evacuation point. But we'll have to move fast." Elon's mind whirred, calculating the possibilities. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. And right now, better than nothing was all they had. "Let's do it," Elon said, his voice resolute. "We don't stop until the fire is contained, or we make it to safety." He turned toward the others, his gaze unwavering. This wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about the people who had believed in him, who had followed him. He would do whatever it took to get them out alive. With that, the team set to work, grabbing what supplies they could carry and preparing for the risky journey to the North Ridge. There was no guarantee that they would make it, no guarantee that the fire wouldn't overtake them. But Elon had never been one to rely on guarantees. As they moved out, he looked up at the sky, the dark smoke swirling above them. The heat from the flames was now more intense than ever. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not ever. The smoke was suffocating. It seemed to coat everything, the thick gray clouds swirling above them like a blanket of despair. Elon Musk and his team marched steadily toward the northern ridge, their steps heavy but purposeful. The air was stifling, the heat unbearable, but they couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they had one last chance to make it out. "Elon, we've got to pick up the pace," Jeremy called out, his voice strained but determined. "The fire's moving fast, and we're not going to make it unless we hustle." Elon nodded grimly. He knew the stakes were high, but the thought of leading his team into the flames without a solid plan was unbearable. They had to find a way to slow the fire's progress, to create a barrier that would protect them long enough to escape. If they failed here, it would be over. And that wasn't an option. "Everyone, keep up. We're almost there," Elon called back, trying to keep the team's spirits high despite the overwhelming odds. "Stay focused. We don't stop until we reach the ridge." As they pushed forward, the sound of the fire in the distance grew louder, a constant reminder of how little time they had. The flames were closing in, creeping toward them with terrifying speed. The ridge was the only option left, a narrow strip of land high enough that they could try to create a firebreak strong enough to divert the blaze. But it was risky, very risky. If they didn't act quickly and strategically, they would be trapped. Elon could feel the sweat pouring down his face, the weight of the situation settling over him like a crushing burden. His thoughts raced. Could they really make it? Was this just a desperate gamble, or was there a real chance of survival? They had no other choice. If they didn't try now, they would be giving up. And giving up was never an option for him. "Melanie," he called as she fell into step beside him. "What's the status on the aerial teams?" She wiped the sweat from her brow and checked her communication device. "They're circling overhead, but they're struggling to get through the smoke. Visibility's too low for accurate drops. We'll need to clear a space for them to get in closer. Can we clear it fast enough?" Elon asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Not unless we make the ridge our focal point," Melanie replied. "If we can clear a path and get the firebreak set up right there, the aerial teams might be able to drop water or retardant from a safer distance." Elon's mind shifted into high gear. It was a long shot, but they didn't have time for anything else. They had to make it work. He signaled to Jeremy and the others, who were already setting up equipment, shovels, flamethrowers, and fire-resistant barriers. They had reached the base of the ridge now, and it was steeper than Elon had imagined. It would take every ounce of energy they had left to climb it, especially under the weight of the heat and smoke. "Elon, look!" Jeremy shouted, pointing toward the sky. "We're getting some air support. The choppers are moving into position." Elon turned to see the silhouette of the helicopters emerging through the smoke, their rotors beating steadily as they approached. The sound of the helicopters gave him a sense of reassurance, even if it was fleeting. They still had to make it through the next few hours without being consumed by the fire. As they climbed the ridge, the temperature seemed to rise even higher. The air was thick with ash, and the only light now was the flickering orange glow of the flames below. The ground beneath them was dry and cracked, the soil tinderbox ready, as though a single spark could set it all ablaze. "Elon," Melanie called out, "we've got to hurry. The fire's advancing faster than we expected." He didn't need to be told twice. The urgency in her voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. They scrambled to reach the top of the ridge, their legs burning, their lungs aching. But their resolve never wavered. They were so close now. Once they reached the summit, they would begin digging. They would create the firebreak, and they would survive. Elon's mind flashed to everything that had brought him to this point. The companies, the innovations, the relentless pursuit of the impossible. He had faced failure before, but he had always found a way forward. This time, the stakes were higher, the consequences more personal, but the principles remained the same. Never give up. Keep pushing forward. Finally, they reached the top. The view was breathtaking in its devastation. Below them, the fire raged, the flames dancing across the landscape like a living, breathing thing. The fire's ferocity was unlike anything Elon had ever seen. It was a force of nature that no technology, no matter how advanced, could completely contain. "Elon, we need to act fast," Melanie said, urgency in her voice. "The wind's shifting again. If it turns toward the ridge, we'll be in the direct path of the fire." He nodded. "Let's make it happen. Start clearing the area. We need to dig in deep." The team set to work, using shovels and heavy equipment to scrape away vegetation and dig trenches. They worked in a frenzy, with the clock ticking down to 0. Every move they made felt like it could mean the difference between life and death. They needed to create a large enough break in the land to stop the fire from crossing over to the ridge, where they were. If the fire broke through, there would be no escape. "We're almost there," Jeremy shouted. "Just a few more feet and we'll have the break." Elon wiped the sweat from his brow and took a deep breath. His heart was racing, but he didn't let it show. They were so close. The fire, though still threatening, had been slowed by the barriers they had set up earlier. This final push would either hold or collapse everything they had worked for. Just as they completed the firebreak, the first helicopter appeared overhead, dropping a heavy payload of fire retardant over the area. The red slurry rained down, coating the land in a protective barrier. For a moment, the team stood in silence, watching the aerial support do its job. The fire was being contained, just long enough to give them time to escape. But then, as quickly as the relief came, it was followed by a new threat. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the valley, sending the fire surging forward faster than ever. It began to climb the ridge, its flames reaching for them with horrifying speed. "No! Move!" Elon shouted, adrenaline surging through his veins. The team scrambled, grabbing the last of their gear and running for the narrow path that would lead them to safety. The fire was right behind them now, closing in like a hungry predator. But they had one final advantage. The break they had created was slowing the flames just enough to give them a narrow window to escape. Elon's heart pounded as he led the charge down the ridge. He could feel the heat on his back, the sting of the smoke in his eyes, but he kept running. There was no turning back. The fire was still there, still threatening everything. But they were moving fast, moving together. Just as they reached the lower valley, the sound of helicopters overhead was replaced by the low rumble of additional emergency vehicles coming in from the nearby town. The cavalry had arrived. For the first time in hours, Elon allowed himself to exhale. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made it. They had bought themselves time. And in a world where everything was in constant motion, that was all they needed. The air was thick with tension as Elon and his team stood at the edge of the valley, looking back toward the ridge they had just descended. The fire had stalled, but it was far from over. There was still danger in every direction, and they were still on the clock. The sound of helicopters grew louder, but even their mighty presence couldn't quell the rising fear in the pit of Elon's stomach. They had made it down the ridge, but the fire was still roaring in the distance. The smell of burning wood and smoke was everywhere, clinging to their clothes and hair. As they gathered in the temporary shelter they had set up, Elon looked over his team. They were battered, exhausted, but alive. For now, that was all that mattered. "We did what we could," Elon said, his voice hoarse but steady. "The firebreak is holding for now, but we're not out of danger yet. We need to keep moving and keep pushing forward. If we can get to the evacuation point, we'll be able to secure a safer location." Melanie wiped the sweat from her forehead and nodded. "We've got one more shot at this. The air support is still coming in, but the roads are barely passable. If we don't make it soon, we'll be completely cut off." Elon ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. There was no time to waste. If they didn't move now, they would be trapped. The ridge was a temporary solution, but it wasn't enough to guarantee safety. They needed a new plan, one that would take them out of the fire's direct path and into a position where they could make their final stand. "We're going to have to cut through the forest," Elon said, a sharpness to his tone. "There's a road on the other side, and if we can reach it, we'll have a better chance of getting to the evacuation point." Jeremy's face twisted in concern. "You know how dense the forest is. If the fire spreads that way, we'll be right in its path." "I know," Elon replied, "but we don't have a choice. We either keep moving, or we risk being surrounded. We can't afford to wait here any longer." The decision was made. They would trek through the forest and hope they could reach the road in time. Elon felt a sense of determination flood through him. There was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. They had to keep moving. As they moved into the thick woods, the sound of crackling fire behind them faded into the background, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the rhythmic pounding of their footsteps. The forest was dense, and the air was damp with humidity, making it difficult to breathe. But the further they walked, the more determined Elon became. He had built rockets that soared into space. He had created electric cars that challenged the very definition of transportation. This was just another challenge, another obstacle to overcome. "I don't like this," Melanie said, looking around nervously. "The smoke's getting thicker." "We're almost there," Elon said, though his voice lacked conviction. The smoke was indeed getting thicker, the air heavier. They couldn't afford to slow down now, but it felt like they were being suffocated by the weight of the fire and the forest. They pushed forward, cutting through branches and pushing through undergrowth. The path they were on was treacherous, but every step brought them closer to safety. Elon's heart pounded, not just from the exertion, but from the nagging fear that they weren't moving fast enough. "Look," Jeremy shouted, pointing ahead. "There's the road." A collective breath of relief rippled through the group. The road was just ahead, a narrow, winding path that led toward the evacuation point. It was their way out, their lifeline. But as they neared the road, a sudden, deafening roar broke through the forest, the fire. It had surged forward, and the wind had shifted, pushing the flames right into their path. "Elon!" Melanie screamed. "We're trapped." Panic surged through Elon's chest. The fire was moving faster than he had anticipated, and they were caught in the middle of it. There was no time to think. He grabbed Melanie's arm and pulled her forward. "Run!" Elon shouted. "Run!" They sprinted toward the road, but the fire was closing in, the heat nearly unbearable. Every step felt like they were running through an inferno, but they couldn't stop. The flames were fast and relentless. They had to outrun them. The team ran as fast as they could, but the fire was faster. Elon could hear the crackling of the flames behind them, the roar of the inferno chasing them down. The heat was intense, the smoke stinging their eyes and throat. It felt like the world was closing in around them, but they kept running. They reached the road just as the fire reached the edge of the forest. The fire was at their heels, and the path ahead was uncertain. There was no clear evacuation point, no escape route. They had made it this far, but the next step was even more critical. They had to find shelter before the fire consumed everything in its path. "Elon, what now?" Jeremy gasped, looking back at the fire, which was just a few yards behind them. Elon scanned the area. There was no time to think, no time to question their options. He looked at the team, their faces covered in soot and fear. They were exhausted, but they were still alive. And as long as they were alive, there was still hope. "There." Elon pointed to a small building off in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was a chance, a place to regroup, to reassess. They had to move fast. The team sprinted toward the building, their legs burning, their lungs screaming for air. The fire was just a few hundred yards away now, its heat blistering against their backs. They could feel the heat radiating off the flames, but they couldn't stop. They had to make it. With one final push, they reached the building. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them out of immediate danger. They ducked inside, slamming the door behind them. Elon collapsed against the wall, panting heavily. The team followed, each one looking like they had just run a marathon. Their clothes were singed, their faces smeared with ash, but they were alive. They had made it. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The only sound was their labored breathing and the distant roar of the fire. "Elon," Melanie said quietly, "we made it. We're alive." He nodded, his mind racing. They were safe for now. But the fire wasn't done yet, and they had no guarantee of what would happen next. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this round. The small building, little more than a steel-framed shack used by emergency services, was a haven in the storm of fire and smoke that raged outside. Elon leaned against the cold metal wall, his mind in turmoil. His team was safe, for now, but they were still trapped in a volatile situation. The fire was closing in, its destructive path relentless and unforgiving. "We need a plan," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "The fire's not going to stop, and we're running out of options." Melanie, who had been pacing the small space, nodded grimly. "We've got to get to the evacuation point. If we don't, we risk getting caught in the firestorm. We need to get to the perimeter and wait for the helicopters to pick us up." Elon took a deep breath and nodded. They had been running on fumes for hours, and the thought of a long journey ahead of them filled him with a sense of dread. But there was no other choice. The fire was unpredictable. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The plan was simple: get out, stay ahead of the flames, and hope the helicopters could find them. "We don't have much time," Jeremy said, looking nervously out the small window. "The fire's moving toward us. We're not out of the woods yet." Elon's gaze followed Jeremy's. Outside, the sky had turned an angry orange, the sun barely visible through the thick smoke that now blanketed the land. The air was stifling, and every breath felt like a struggle. The fire was close, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. "We'll make it," Elon said, the words more of a declaration than a promise. "We'll get to the evacuation point." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Could they really make it? The road was still miles away, and the fire was unpredictable. They didn't have the resources to fight it head-on. They had to rely on their wits, and Elon's mind raced through every possible scenario, every option they had left. "Elon, we're not going to make it if we don't leave now," Melanie said, her voice urgent. "We need to move, or we're going to be stuck here." He met her gaze, seeing the fear in her eyes, and he knew she was right. The fire was relentless, and the clock was ticking. They had to move, and they had to do it quickly. Elon took a deep breath and stood up, motioning for the team to follow. "We move now," he said, his voice steady. "Stay close, and don't look back. We'll make it through this." The team gathered their gear, checking each other's supplies. They knew they couldn't afford to waste any time. The fire was closing in, and every moment counted. As they stepped outside, the heat was almost unbearable. The air was thick with smoke, and the sun had all but disappeared behind the thick clouds of ash. The sound of the fire crackling in the distance was a constant reminder of the danger that loomed over them. "Elon, we're not going to make it in time," Jeremy said, his voice strained. "The fire's moving fast. It's only a matter of time before it catches up to us." Elon's heart skipped a beat. They had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop. They couldn't afford to hesitate. "We'll make it," he repeated, more to himself than to Jeremy. "We just need to keep pushing forward." The team set out, walking briskly through the dense forest, the sounds of crackling fire growing louder with every step. The path was treacherous, the ground uneven, and every branch they passed seemed to reach out like a trap, waiting to slow them down. But they pressed on, undeterred. As they walked, the smoke grew thicker, and the air became even more suffocating. Elon could feel his chest tightening with every breath. It felt like the fire was right on their heels, its heat intensifying with each passing moment. They had to stay ahead, stay focused, or they would be consumed by it. "I can see it," Melanie shouted, her voice filled with relief. "There's the clearing up ahead. The road's just past it." Elon's heart skipped a beat. They were almost there. But even as he saw the clearing ahead, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The fire had shifted. The wind had changed direction, and the flames were now roaring through the forest at a speed Elon had never seen before. "Elon, it's too late," Jeremy shouted. "We can't outrun it." Elon turned to see the fire moving toward them like a tidal wave, consuming everything in its path. The sound of the flames was deafening, and the heat was unbearable. The forest around them was burning, the trees collapsing as the fire devoured everything in its wake. "Move!" Elon shouted. "Keep running." They sprinted toward the clearing, the heat growing unbearable as the fire rushed closer. The smoke was so thick now that they could barely see. It felt like the world was collapsing in on them, but Elon refused to let panic take over. They had come this far. They couldn't give up now. Just as the fire reached the edge of the clearing, the first of the helicopters appeared overhead. The sound of its rotors was like a lifeline, a symbol of hope in the midst of the chaos. "Get to the clearing," Elon yelled. "We're almost there." The team pushed forward with everything they had left, their muscles burning, their lungs screaming for air. The helicopter hovered above, its spotlight searching for them in the smoke. Elon could see the outline of the chopper, the hope of rescue just within reach. But just as they neared the clearing, the ground beneath them trembled. The fire had caught up, and it was everywhere. The heat was unbearable, and the sound of the flames seemed to swallow everything else. "Elon!" Melanie screamed, her voice filled with panic. "We can't make it." But Elon's mind was clear. He could see the helicopter, and he could see the road just beyond it. They had to make it. With one final push, they burst into the clearing, the fire behind them a roaring inferno. The helicopter's spotlight found them, and the sound of the rotors grew louder. "Get on board!" the pilot shouted from above. "Hurry!" The team scrambled into the helicopter, each one of them pulling themselves up, their bodies weak but their determination stronger than ever. As the helicopter lifted off, Elon looked down at the landscape they were leaving behind, a landscape consumed by flames. The fire was still raging, but they had made it out. They were alive. For now, survival had come at a steep price. Elon had lost more than just resources and time. He had faced his own limitations, his own fears. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was ahead, one for rebuilding, for hope, for redemption. As the helicopter soared into the sky, leaving the flames behind, Elon Musk found himself once again thinking of the future. What would they rebuild from the ashes? What would this crisis teach them? The fire had claimed so much, but Elon knew this was just one chapter in the larger story of survival. And he would keep fighting, because that's what he did. The hum of the helicopter blades filled the air as it soared above the landscape, now a smoldering shadow of what it once had been. From the air, Elon could see the extent of the devastation. The entire valley was consumed by fire, with the earth below covered in a thick blanket of ash. The land, once lush and vibrant, was now unrecognizable, scarred by the flames. Elon leaned against the side of the helicopter, looking out at the destruction. His thoughts were heavy, and the weight of everything that had happened was starting to settle in. The fire had claimed so much, but it had also exposed something deep within him, something he wasn't ready to face yet. The team sat in silence around him, each of them staring out the windows, lost in their own thoughts. Melanie's face was drawn, her eyes red from the smoke and exhaustion. Jeremy sat beside her, his hand resting on his forehead, trying to process everything. The chaos, the fear, the sheer devastation. They had all experienced something they would never forget. But the silence was shattered by the sudden voice of the pilot over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing at the evac base shortly. It's going to be a rough landing, so brace yourselves." Elon nodded absently, his mind still racing. The thought of the base, a temporary refuge from the madness, offered no comfort. There was nothing that could ease the sting of loss. They had made it out alive, yes, but at what cost? Elon had always prided himself on being a visionary, a problem solver. But nothing in his wealth of experience had prepared him for something like this. This crisis was different. It wasn't just about managing resources or innovation. It was about survival, human endurance, and the fight to rebuild. The helicopter descended quickly, the ground approaching rapidly as they neared the makeshift evac base, a clearing in the forest that had been converted into a staging area for rescue operations. As the wheels hit the ground, there was a jolt, but nothing that knocked them off balance. The team quickly disembarked, stepping out onto the rough terrain, their legs wobbly from the adrenaline crash. "We're here," Melanie said quietly, looking up at the grim, gray sky. "But what now?" Elon didn't answer immediately. His mind was already turning, processing the next steps. They had made it to safety for now, but the fight wasn't over. The evacuation was just a temporary solution. There was still the question of what they would do next, how they would recover from this catastrophe and, more importantly, how they could prevent something like this from happening again. As the team gathered around, the reality of their situation began to set in. They were safe, but they were still in shock, physically and emotionally drained. Elon felt the weight of their exhaustion, the strain in their faces. It had been hours since they'd left the building, hours since the fire had started its rampage. And yet, it felt like days. "We need to regroup," Elon said finally, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. "Find some shelter, assess our resources, and figure out the next steps." Melanie nodded, her eyes narrowing as she looked around the base. It was a temporary setup, with a few tents and makeshift medical stations. A couple of military trucks were parked off to the side, with personnel moving quickly in every direction. The base was bustling with activity, but the underlying tension was palpable. No one knew when the next wave of disaster would hit. There were no guarantees in the midst of such chaos. "Let's go talk to the command center," Jeremy suggested. "We might be able to get some intel on the fire's progress and see if there are any other evac points we should know about." Elon agreed, though his mind was still focused on the bigger picture. He had faced corporate battles, space challenges, and technological obstacles. But this was something he hadn't been prepared for. The magnitude of the crisis had shaken him in a way that no business venture or scientific endeavor ever could. As they walked toward the command center, Elon couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He was used to managing companies, projects, and innovations, but now he was faced with something far more urgent. This fire wasn't just a crisis for his team. It was a crisis for everyone involved, and it wasn't going to stop until they found a solution. The command center was a large tent at the center of the evac base, its walls lined with maps and screens displaying real-time data about the fire's movement. Several officers were huddled around, discussing strategies and coordinating the efforts of various teams. A couple of emergency responders stood nearby, taking notes and offering updates. Elon approached one of the officers, a woman in her early 30s with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Can you give us an update on the fire's status?" he asked. She glanced up at him, recognizing him instantly, though there was no sign of recognition in her tone. She was all business. "We're tracking the fire's movement in real time," she said, pointing to a large screen displaying a digital map of the area. "It's still spreading north, but we've got multiple teams working on containment lines. It's slow progress, but we're making headway." Elon studied the map. The fire's path was unpredictable, but it was clear that it wasn't just spreading, it was intensifying. The landscape around them was devastated, but what worried him more was the fact that the fire could flare up again at any moment, especially if the weather conditions changed. "We need to act quickly," he said, more to himself than to the officer. "If the fire keeps moving at this pace, it's going to hit critical infrastructure soon." The officer nodded. "We're aware. We've already deployed teams to the most vulnerable areas, but we're still waiting on air support. The terrain is too dangerous for some of the heavy machinery to get through." Elon's mind raced. This was bad, worse than he had imagined. The fire was moving faster than they could contain it, and the logistical challenges were mounting. What if they couldn't stop it? What if they couldn't save everyone? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he quickly pushed the thoughts aside. There was no room for doubt now. The situation was critical, and he needed to act. "We can't wait for air support," he said. "I know it's risky, but we need to consider evacuating the surrounding areas ourselves, get the civilians out, get the team to safety." The officer's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "That would be a logistical nightmare, but you're right. We can't just sit here waiting. I'll make the arrangements." As the officer moved to take action, Elon turned to Melanie and Jeremy, who had been listening quietly. "This is bigger than anything we've faced before," he said, his voice low. We're not just fighting a fire. We're fighting for people's lives. And if we don't get ahead of this, it's going to be too late. Melanie nodded, a determined look crossing her face. We'll help however we can. We're in this together. Jeremy clapped him on the back. We've made it this far. We'll make it through this too. Elon took a deep breath, the weight of their words grounding him in the reality of the situation. He had always believed in innovation, in finding solutions no matter how difficult the problem. But this was different. It wasn't just about technology. It was about the people. He knew the road ahead would be long, and it would require everything they had. But if there was one thing he was certain of, it was that they couldn't afford to fail now. The real battle had just begun. Have you ever been faced with the impossible? A challenge so overwhelming that the only choice was to keep moving forward? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The ash-covered land beneath them was a testament to what had been lost. But Elon knew that as long as they had breath in their lungs, they could still rebuild. And he would lead the charge. The command center was a whirlwind of activity. Elon stood at the back of the tent, observing the organized chaos. On the surface, it appeared like everything was under control, but beneath the surface, there was an underlying tension. He could see it in the faces of the emergency responders, the commanders, and even the civilians who had made it to safety. They were all waiting for something, an answer, a plan, a breakthrough. Elon knew that answers were in short supply. What they needed wasn't just manpower or equipment. They needed a revolutionary solution, something that could turn the tide of the crisis. The current methods of firefighting were limited, and the fire was evolving faster than they could contain it. He had always prided himself on solving problems that others deemed impossible, but this was different. It wasn't just a problem of resources or technology. It was a problem of scale. The fire was not something they could simply put out with a few helicopters or fire trucks. It was massive, unpredictable, and moving faster than anyone could have anticipated. And as Elon stood there, listening to the frantic reports from the field, he realized that the only way they would survive this crisis was if they approached it differently. Jeremy, Elon said, turning to his two closest allies. We need to think outside the box. We need innovation. Melanie, who had been listening intently to the updates, looked at him. What do you mean? We're not going to win this by doing things the traditional way, Elon said, his voice steady but firm. We need to bring in technology, new ideas, new tools. We need to rethink how we approach fire management. Jeremy raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting something like drones or robots? Elon nodded, his mind already racing. Exactly. We need drones that can fly into the heart of the fire and map its spread in real time. We need robots that can work autonomously, clearing debris, building fire breaks, and even putting out small fires before they can spread. And we need satellite technology to track the fire's movement on a global scale. Melanie frowned. But we don't have the infrastructure for that here. The area's too remote, and we're already stretched thin with resources. Elon met her gaze, his eyes filled with resolve. Then we build it. We don't wait for permission. We don't wait for the perfect conditions. We act now. I know what it takes to build things from scratch, and this is worth it. Jeremy nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'm with you. But how do we get the drones, robots, and satellites operational so quickly? This is a huge undertaking. Elon's eyes gleamed with determination. We don't do it alone. We call in every favor we can, leverage every connection. We pull in the best minds from our companies, SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, and partner with anyone who can help. We get the ball rolling, and we keep it rolling. With that, the wheels were in motion. Elon was no stranger to building things under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't just about engineering the next groundbreaking rocket or electric car. This was about saving lives. It was about rethinking an entire industry that had been stuck in the past for too long. And Elon knew that if anyone could bring the future of firefighting to life, it was him. The team quickly got to work, pulling in experts from all corners of the globe. Elon knew that this would take an immense amount of coordination, but he was used to that. He had led teams through challenging projects before, and he would do it again. He called up his contacts at Tesla to begin building the necessary infrastructure for the drones and robots. We need lightweight, high-powered drones that can withstand extreme heat. I want them to be equipped with sensors that can detect temperature and map the fire in real time. They need to be fully autonomous, capable of flying into areas that are too dangerous for humans. The Tesla team was on it immediately. Engineers began working around the clock to modify existing drone models and create new ones tailored for the task at hand. The same went for the robots. They needed to be nimble enough to navigate through debris, fire-resistant, and equipped with the latest AI to make decisions in real time. Elon then turned his attention to SpaceX. I need satellite data, and I need it now. We need to track the fire's movement on a global scale. We also need to create communication networks in areas where the infrastructure is down. Get the Starlink team involved and get us connected. Within hours, SpaceX began redirecting satellites to monitor the fire and feed real-time data back to the command center. The engineers worked tirelessly to optimize the system, ensuring they could track the fire's movements with precision. In parallel, the Starlink network was activated to provide internet coverage to the remote areas that had lost communication. With the resources at his disposal, Elon was able to pull together a team of experts who were working tirelessly to develop these cutting-edge technologies. The stakes had never been higher. The fire was still raging, and every minute that passed meant more lives were at risk. But Elon was driven, not by the scale of the challenge, but by the possibility of changing the way fires were fought forever. Hours passed, and the pieces began to fall into place. The first batch of drones was ready for deployment. They had been tested in simulations, and although they weren't fully battle-tested, they were a step forward. Elon wasn't one to wait for perfection. He believed in iteration, in the power of doing, not waiting. The robots, too, were being prepped for action, ready to clear debris and create fire breaks. The first drones were launched, their small frames buzzing through the air as they flew toward the heart of the fire. The sensors on board began mapping the fire's spread, sending back real-time data that was processed and analyzed in the command center. The team was able to pinpoint hotspots, track the fire's movement, and begin developing countermeasures. The robots were deployed shortly afterward. They began clearing paths through the debris, working tirelessly to create fire breaks that would slow the fire's spread. It was a sight to behold, machines working in harmony with the humans on the ground, all driven by the same goal, survival. But as the drones mapped the fire's progress, Elon could see the real scale of the crisis. The fire was still growing. The technology was working, but it wasn't enough to stop the blaze entirely. The fire had gained too much ground, and it was spreading faster than they could contain it. Elon, we've got a problem, Jeremy said, his voice urgent. The fire's moving into new areas. It's picking up speed. Elon clenched his fists. We're not going to stop here. We push harder. We innovate faster. They had made progress, yes, but the crisis wasn't over. The fire was still out of control, and Elon knew they were only scratching the surface of what was needed to turn the tide. There was more to do, and the clock was ticking. But one thing was certain, he would not give up. Not when lives were on the line. Not when innovation could be the key to saving them all. The command center buzzed with activity as Elon paced back and forth, eyeing the real-time data feeds and occasional reports from the ground. He could see the progress they were making, drones flying over the fire, robots clearing debris, satellites tracking the fire's expansion, but it still wasn't enough. Not yet. The fire was relentless, and every minute they spent fighting it was a minute closer to losing everything. The drones were providing invaluable data. The fire had been mapped in a way that no human could have done. They pinpointed the key areas where the fire was spreading and allowed them to deploy resources more strategically. However, the scale of the disaster was far larger than anyone had anticipated, and the fire was still gaining ground. We need more drones, Elon muttered under his breath, his mind working furiously. More robots. More resources. We need a second wave. Melanie, who had been reviewing the data on her tablet, looked up. Elon, we're already pushing the limits of what we can do with the technology we have. The drones and robots are working, but it's not enough to slow the fire down on a large scale. Elon looked at her, frustration and determination fighting for dominance in his chest. I know, But this is just the beginning. The technology is there. It just needs to be scaled up. We have to push harder. We can't let this thing burn everything down. We've come too far. He turned back to the screen, watching the map as the fire crept ever closer to a crucial power station. The impact of losing power would be devastating, not just to the evac center but to the surrounding area as well. The network of responders, helicopters, and emergency services that had been mobilized would lose their coordination. They would be plunged into darkness. "We've got to protect that station," Elon said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "I need all hands on deck for that." "What's the status of the backup power?" A nearby officer spoke up, her face tight with concern. "The backup power is holding for now, but the fire is getting too close. If we lose it, the evacuation operation is going to fall apart." Elon's thoughts raced. Losing the station wasn't an option, not with everything at stake. He had to make sure the power stayed on, no matter what. "We're going to push forward with everything we've got," Elon said firmly. "I need more drones, more robots, and more people. Contact every partner, every company we can. We're not leaving this to chance." Melanie nodded, her expression determined. "Understood. I'll call in Tesla's teams to help with the backup power. They can set up a secondary network in case the worst happens." Elon appreciated her pragmatism, but there was no time to waste. Every second counted. As Melanie made the necessary calls, Elon turned his attention back to the map. The fire had begun to circle back in on itself, expanding rapidly in multiple directions, and they were running out of time. He approached the head of operations, a senior commander who had been in the field for over 20 years. "Can we deploy the drones directly into the fire to set up a firebreak?" The commander hesitated, eyeing the map. "It's risky, Elon. The heat levels are extreme in that area, and the drones are built for aerial mapping, not fire suppression. We're not sure they can withstand it." Elon's face hardened with resolve. "I don't care about the risks. We need to try. We can't wait around and hope the fire doesn't spread. I've seen technology do impossible things before. Let's make it happen." The commander nodded, looking over at the team of engineers who had been working nonstop to modify the drones. Within moments, they scrambled to load the new fire-resistant technology onto the drones. The task would be difficult, but not impossible. They had to make it work. They had no other choice. Meanwhile, outside the command center, the sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie glow over the smoke-filled sky. The team on the ground was scrambling to build fire breaks, to evacuate civilians, to create defenses. The human effort was impressive, but the reality of the situation was clear. There was no way to stop this fire without technology. Melanie's voice broke through his thoughts as she returned to his side. "I've spoken with the Tesla teams. They're setting up secondary generators, but the fire's moving fast. We've got a 2-hour window to secure the power station. After that, it's going to be a lost cause." Elon's heart raced. 2 hours. That was all they had. He needed to make it count. He turned to the team working on the drones. "Deploy them. Now." The drones, newly equipped with fire-resistant armor and enhanced heat detection sensors, were to life. They were deployed into the heart of the fire, each drone carefully navigating through the smoke and heat. On the command center screens, Elon could see the drones' flight paths. It was a dangerous mission, one that no one had attempted before, but it was the only option left. Hours passed in tense silence. Elon stood with Melanie and Jeremy, eyes glued to the screens as the drones mapped the fire's spread. The battle was still unfolding, and while they had made progress, it felt like the fire was only moments away from destroying everything they had worked so hard to protect. Then, just as they feared, a sudden burst of flame shot up from the fire's center, triggering a chain reaction that sent a massive wave of heat directly toward the power station. Elon's stomach twisted in horror. "Deploy the fire suppression drones now," he shouted. The engineers scrambled to initiate the sequence. Elon's gaze stayed fixed on the monitor as the drones shot through the smoke, closing in on the fire at the power station. Their goal was simple: create a barrier, a fire break, to prevent the flames from reaching the station. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was their only chance. "Come on," Elon whispered, watching the drones weave their way into the inferno. They deployed small fire suppression units, working in tandem to push back the flames. The heat was intense, but the drones held their ground, using their sensors to guide them through the chaos. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The fire seemed to be retreating, but it wasn't over yet. Elon held his breath, his eyes never leaving the screen. Then, slowly but surely, the fire began to subside. The suppression drones had managed to establish a firebreak around the power station, and the flames were finally contained. Elon let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The power station had been saved, by technology, by sheer will, and by the incredible people who had worked tirelessly to make it happen. "We did it," Melanie said softly, her voice filled with disbelief. "For now," Elon replied, his tone steady but resolute. "We've won this round. But the war is far from over." As the team exhaled in relief, Elon couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They had fought back the fire today, and while the battle was far from over, he knew one thing for certain. As long as they had innovation on their side, they could keep fighting. The night had fallen over the command center, and with it, a deceptive calm. Outside, the fire still raged, its flames licking at the dry earth and consuming everything in its path. But inside, there was a fragile sense of accomplishment. The power station had been saved. The drones had done their job. The fire breaks were holding, for now. Elon stood by the large screens, staring at the maps and data as the night continued to unfold. He could feel the weight of the crisis pressing down on him. Despite their successes, they were still a long way from being out of danger. The fire was unpredictable, and no one knew for certain where it would strike next. "Are we in the clear?" Jeremy asked, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and cautious optimism. He had been with Elon through many crises, but even he had never seen something this intense. "No," Elon replied, his voice steady but unwavering. "We've bought ourselves some time, but the fire is still unpredictable. The wind could change at any moment, and we have to be ready for that. We need to stay alert." Melanie walked over, looking at the satellite feeds. The fire had started to turn again, pushing into new, uncharted areas. They were tracking its movement with precision, but even that wasn't enough. The real-time data was critical, but it wasn't an all-encompassing solution. "Elon," she said, her tone thoughtful, "what if we deploy more resources? The drones and robots are doing well, but there's a limit to what they can achieve without more manpower. Should we consider bringing in more crews to help with ground-level operations?" Elon ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The challenge wasn't just about more manpower. It was about leveraging their existing resources more effectively. He had learned a long time ago that being resourceful wasn't just about having more. It was about using what you had in smarter ways. And in this case, that meant thinking bigger. "I don't think we're at the point where we can just add more bodies and expect a miracle," Elon said. "What we need is something more disruptive. We've already started making progress with the drones and robots, but we're missing something. We need to think about how to scale up what we've already done, how to adapt it in real time." Jeremy leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean more automation? Like autonomous fire breaks?" Elon's eyes lit up. "Exactly. Autonomous systems that don't just react to the fire, they anticipate it. We need the technology to predict where the fire will spread and take action before it even reaches those areas. It's about creating systems that aren't just responding, they're thinking ahead." Melanie raised an eyebrow. "That's a big leap. It's one thing to react with robots and drones. It's another to build systems that can anticipate something as chaotic and unpredictable as a wildfire." Elon smiled, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "That's the whole point. The fire may be unpredictable, but we have the technology to predict other things, like wind patterns, temperature shifts, humidity. We can feed all of that data into an AI system, let it analyze the patterns, and create a dynamic response that adjusts to the fire's movements. But that would require a whole new infrastructure," Jeremy pointed out. "A massive one. And it's not like we can just build it overnight." Elon's gaze was steady, unwavering. "We don't have the luxury of time, but we've got the brains, the technology, and the willingness to try. We don't wait for the perfect solution, we create it." He turned toward the operations team, who had been listening to the conversation. "We're going to take everything we've learned so far and accelerate it. We're going to build autonomous systems that can predict the fire's behavior in real time. And we're going to deploy them faster than anything we've ever done before." There was a murmur of agreement among the team. The challenge was daunting, but Elon had always thrived in moments of adversity. He didn't see problems as obstacles. He saw them as opportunities to innovate. And that was exactly what they needed right now. As the hours passed, the team worked tirelessly to refine their approach. Elon called in experts from every corner of his companies, from Tesla's AI specialists to SpaceX engineers who could help build the systems that would allow the autonomous technology to function. They needed real-time data, real-time response, and the kind of flexibility that only advanced AI could provide. But the night wasn't just about technology. It was about people. People on the ground were fighting not just to contain the fire, but to protect lives, homes, and entire communities. Elon knew that the technology would help, but it would never replace the human spirit that was driving the fight. At dawn, the situation had escalated. The fire had shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. The wind had picked up, and with it, the flames spread faster than they could keep up. As the fire engulfed a new sector, a sense of urgency rippled through the command center. The autonomous systems were still being fine-tuned, and the ground crews were in a race against time to fortify the most vulnerable areas. Elon received a call from one of the lead fire commanders. "Elon, we've got a critical situation. The fire's advancing toward the North Ridge, and if it gets there, it will create a perfect storm of firestorms. We need to deploy everything we've got, and we need to do it fast." His pulse quickened. This was the moment of truth. "Send everything you've got to the North Ridge," Elon ordered. "We're deploying our next wave of drones. But this time, they're not just tracking the fire. They're going to create a firebreak and fight back against it. We need to push the fire in a new direction. And we need it done now." The engineers went into overdrive. The next wave of drones, now equipped with advanced AI-driven systems that analyzed the fire's movement, took flight. As they soared toward the North Ridge, they deployed fire-suppressant materials, directing them in ways they had never done before. It was as if the drones themselves were working in perfect harmony with the environment, anticipating the fire's every move. Back at the command center, Elon watched the screens with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The drones had reached the ridge, and for a moment, it looked like the fire might be contained. But then, a burst of flames shot up from a nearby canyon, and it became clear that the battle was far from over. "Elon," Melanie said, her voice tight with concern, "we're seeing extreme heat signatures in the canyon. The fire's getting out of control again." Elon's mind raced. They had fought so hard to get this far, but it wasn't enough. "Not yet." "We're not done," he said, his voice cold with resolve. "We keep pushing. We keep adapting." He turned back to the map, seeing the fire's unpredictable pattern stretch before him. There was no easy solution, no perfect answer. But one thing was clear. Innovation, the kind that had gotten them this far, would be the key to seeing this through. Elon's resolve solidified in that moment. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with setbacks and unexpected turns, but they would push forward. They had no other choice. And with that thought, the team's second wave of drones launched, taking the fight directly into the heart of the fire. The days blurred together as Elon and his team fought an increasingly volatile battle against the wildfire. Every new piece of technology they deployed, every strategic decision they made, brought them closer to understanding just how big the problem was and how far they still had to go. Outside, the fire continued to rage, though the drones and robots had managed to suppress a large portion of it. But it was still spreading in unpredictable ways. It seemed like for every victory they achieved, a new threat emerged. Wind shifts, sudden temperature spikes, and wild changes in the terrain kept them on their toes. Elon stood at the edge of the command center, looking out at the smoke-filled sky. The sun, obscured by the haze, cast an orange glow over the mountains, a reminder of just how far the fire had spread. There was no rest, no time to pause for reflection. Their current focus was on preventing the fire from breaching a key water reservoir. If it did, it would cut off a vital lifeline to the region, plunging them into a logistical nightmare. "How's it looking?" Elon asked, turning back to Melanie, who had been busy coordinating resources. "The reservoir's in danger," Melanie replied, her face grim. It's not just the fire itself, there are secondary threats too. Landslides from the heat, water contamination. If the reservoir is compromised, it could trigger a chain reaction that will impact hundreds of thousands of people. Elon's mind raced. The reservoir was their last line of defense. Without it, everything they were doing would be for nothing. He'd seen the data on their projections, and while they'd managed to keep the fire at bay for the time being, it wouldn't be long before it breached that final boundary. We need to build a perimeter around the reservoir. Quick, Elon said, his tone firm. Deploy the autonomous systems. Get the drones and robots on the ground to reinforce the barriers. I don't care if it's the most dangerous area on the map. We need to protect that reservoir. Melanie nodded. We've already deployed drones in that area, but we don't have enough coverage. I'll call for more backup. But Elon could sense the underlying tension in her voice. They had pushed every piece of technology they had to its limits, and it still might not be enough. He turned back to the map, watching as the fire spread dangerously close to the reservoir. It was moving fast. The once predictable pattern of the fire had now turned erratic, and they were struggling to keep up. The drones they had been relying on had been effective, but they weren't enough to fight the sheer scale of the fire. It was as if the landscape itself was shifting under their feet. We need to rethink the strategy, Elon said. What if we can't stop it with just drones and robots? What if we need to create an entirely new system, something that works alongside the fire rather than just reacting to it? Jeremy, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, spoke up. What do you have in mind? Elon paused, staring at the screen. For a moment, he felt a shift in his own thinking, a new direction forming in his mind. We've been focused on suppressing the fire, but what if we use the environment itself to fight back? We've got all this data coming in, right? What if we use it to manipulate the fire's behavior? To create controlled bursts of heat in one area to redirect the fire to a safer location? Melanie raised an eyebrow. You mean artificially controlling fire? That's never been done before. It hasn't, Elon agreed. But we've been pioneering technologies that no one thought were possible before. Let's think bigger. If we can predict the fire's next move and artificially trigger a redirection, we might be able to save the reservoir. It's a long shot, but right now, we don't have many options. The room fell silent as everyone processed his words. The idea was audacious. But in a crisis of this magnitude, they needed to try something bold. The drones and robots had done incredible things, but they were still limited. They needed something that could adapt to the fire's unpredictability on the fly. We'll need to coordinate with every department we have, Elon continued. AI, robotics, environmental science, everyone. This can't be just a firefighting mission. It's a mission to outsmart nature. Melanie met his gaze. I'm with you. Let's build this system. Let's make it happen. Within hours, the team began working at full capacity. Elon called on experts from Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and the Boring Company. Teams that were known for solving impossible problems in the face of overwhelming odds. The plan was to leverage everything from satellite technology to real-time fire mapping systems, using machine learning algorithms to predict where the fire would go next and then deploying precise bursts of heat in other areas to control the spread. It wasn't just about fighting the fire. It was about manipulating the environment, anticipating the fire's movements, and then acting before the fire had a chance to move where it shouldn't. The technology they were developing would use AI to predict changes in the wind, temperature, and humidity, and then use that data to create controlled burns that could guide the fire away from key areas. It was, without a doubt, the most ambitious thing they'd ever attempted. But Elon was certain it was their only hope. As the sun began to set again, casting a deep red glow across the sky, Elon gathered the team in the command center. The data had been compiled, and the system was ready to be deployed. This is it, Elon said, his voice filled with determination. We're about to take control of this situation in ways no one has ever attempted before. If we succeed, we can guide the fire away from the reservoir and protect countless lives. If we fail, we'll be facing a disaster of unprecedented scale. He turned to the team, a mixture of resolve and urgency in his eyes. Are you ready? The room fell silent for a moment, and then, one by one, the team nodded. They were all in. It was no longer just about technology. It was about the people they were trying to protect. "Let's do this," Elon said. As the autonomous systems came online and the first wave of data was fed into the AI, they all held their breath. The system had predicted a wind shift, one that could potentially carry the fire toward the reservoir. With a push of a button, Elon watched as the environment began to respond. Controlled bursts of heat were deployed in specific areas, creating barriers that the fire would not be able to cross. The data seemed to align perfectly, and for the first time in days, Elon allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The fire's path began to change, shifting away from the reservoir as predicted. But then, just as quickly as the hope began to rise, the temperature spiked in another area. The fire shifted again, unpredictably, toward a different vulnerable location. "We need to act fast," Elon said, his voice urgent. "Redirect it again. Use everything we've got." The team moved quickly, fine-tuning the data, recalibrating the systems. They had one shot at this. The fire wasn't over yet. The battle was still raging. But as Elon watched the team push forward, fueled by an unyielding determination to innovate and protect, he knew they were on the edge of something monumental. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer just fighting the fire. They were fighting to change the way the world dealt with disaster, forever. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the acrid scent of smoke and ash. Elon stood in the command center, staring at the live feeds of the wildfire as it raged across the landscape. The autonomous systems they deployed had made an impact, but it was clear they were still a step behind. The fire had shifted yet again, this time with ferocity that even their predictive algorithms hadn't anticipated. "Another change in direction," Melanie said, her voice low with concern as she glanced at the screen. "It's moving faster than we can predict." Elon could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had poured everything they had into this plan, every ounce of innovation, every breakthrough they could muster. But nature had a way of humbling even the most advanced technologies. The fire was proving to be a force unlike any they had encountered before. "This is not over," Elon said, his tone sharp. "We're just getting started. If we let this thing get ahead of us, it'll be our undoing." Jeremy, who had been helping coordinate the efforts, spoke up. "The new AI model is working, but it needs more time to adapt. The patterns are still too unpredictable for it to keep up. We may need more direct intervention, boots on the ground." Elon clenched his jaw. He knew the importance of having human eyes on the situation. But even more than that, he was starting to realize something critical. They weren't just fighting a fire. They were fighting against the clock, the elements, and their own limitations. The clock was ticking, and with every passing minute, the stakes grew higher. "We're not out of options," Elon said, a new resolve creeping into his voice. "We've got people on the ground. We've got technology at our disposal. But what we need now is a way to adapt faster, something that gives us an edge, something that will turn the tide in our favor." Melanie looked up, her eyes narrowed as she processed his words. "You're thinking of something new, aren't you?" "I am," Elon replied. "We need to think outside the box. I want to explore using Tesla's autonomous driving technology to control vehicles in the field. If we can integrate it with the drones and robots we have, we might be able to control fire breaks and deploy emergency supplies faster. We're talking about creating an entire network of autonomous responders, vehicles, drones, even people, all working together in real time." The idea was audacious, but it was also brilliant. Tesla's autonomous driving technology was one of the most advanced systems in the world, capable of responding to real-world conditions in real time. If they could scale that technology to work with their existing fire response systems, it might just give them the edge they needed. "But we'll need to adapt the vehicles for the terrain," Jeremy pointed out. "It's not just about getting the vehicles to drive themselves. We'll need to modify them to handle the heat, the smoke, the debris." "I know," Elon said. "We'll take a fleet of Tesla Cybertrucks. They've got the ruggedness to withstand tough conditions, and we can modify them to carry fire suppression equipment and emergency supplies. With real-time updates from our drones, these vehicles will act as a mobile firefighting unit, always one step ahead of the fire." The plan was risky. It meant completely rethinking how they approached the firefight, but Elon's mind was made up. If they didn't try something new, something bold, they risked losing everything. And right now, there was no time for second-guessing. Within hours, the team had mobilized. Engineers and technicians from Tesla, SpaceX, and their other ventures worked around the clock to retrofit the Cybertrucks. The vehicles were equipped with fire suppression systems, reinforced with heat-resistant materials, and integrated with the drones for a seamless response. Elon knew that this new strategy would give them the flexibility they needed, but he also understood that the fire was still evolving, and they were racing against a clock they could not control. As the first convoy of modified Cybertrucks rolled out, the team held its breath. Elon watched as the vehicles made their way through the smoke-filled landscape, navigating the treacherous terrain with remarkable precision. The drones followed closely behind, scouting out the best possible routes and providing real-time data to the trucks, guiding them toward the most vulnerable areas. "It's working," Jeremy said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The drones are coordinating with the trucks. They're already making progress on the North Ridge." But the sense of accomplishment was short-lived. As the convoy reached the ridge, a massive surge of heat burst from the fire below. The trucks, equipped to handle extreme conditions, were able to withstand the heat, but the fire was not the only enemy they had to contend with. A new danger had emerged. The fire had started to trigger secondary explosions. Gas lines were rupturing, and propane tanks were igniting, sending fireballs into the air. "We're under fire!" One of the drivers shouted over the comms, his voice panicked. "This is getting out of control." Elon's heart pounded as he watched the convoy in real time. This wasn't just a natural disaster anymore. This was chaos, a deadly combination of fire, gas, and debris threatening to overwhelm everything they had worked for. "We need to get those trucks to safety," Elon said, his voice steely. "Move them out. Get them away from the explosions. Drones, provide a route." The convoy began to retreat, the trucks swerving to avoid the blasts, but it wasn't easy. The landscape was constantly shifting as the fire spread, and every turn brought a new challenge. The drones buzzed overhead, trying to predict the safest path, but the fire was moving faster than they could keep up. "Damn it," Elon muttered, clenching his fists. He had always known that innovation came with risks, but this was different. The stakes were too high. The price of failure wasn't just financial. It was lives, homes, entire communities. The convoy finally reached a safe zone, but the damage had been done. The fire had spread to a new section of the forest, one that was less accessible. Worse, the damage to the vehicles had been extensive. One of the Cybertrucks had been disabled in the retreat, and several drones had been lost to the flames. "Report," Elon demanded. "We've made some progress," Melanie said, her voice strained. "But the explosion triggered a new wave of fires, and we've lost 2 key vehicles. The drones are still functioning, but we're limited in what they can do on the ground." Elon took a deep breath. "We're not giving up. We've pushed the limits of what's possible. We just need to push harder." The price of innovation had been steep, but Elon knew that they had no choice but to press on. There was no turning back now. The fire was far from over, and every minute felt like a lifetime. But Elon refused to accept failure. They had been through too much, facing every setback, every unexpected twist in the road. And now, they were closer than ever to understanding how to fight not just this fire, but every fire that might come after it. He stood before the command center, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky. The fire was still burning, but he had the sense that something had shifted. This fight was not just about technology or innovation. It was about people. People like the engineers working tirelessly, the drivers pushing their limits, and the families whose lives depended on them. And Elon Musk would not stop until they had done everything in their power to stop the fire. Elon's mind raced as he surveyed the new landscape, watching from the command center as the fire continued to rage in the distance. The flames flickered against the backdrop of an unforgiving sky, shifting with terrifying speed and unpredictable direction. His hands were steady as he adjusted the controls, but inside, he felt a growing sense of urgency. Every move they made had to be precise, or the cost could be catastrophic. The fleet of modified Cybertrucks had managed to create some space between the fire and the key areas they were trying to protect. But it was clear they were only playing catch-up. The secondary explosions had thrown them off course, and even with the state-of-the-art drones, They were facing a disaster that no amount of technology had prepared them for. "We've hit a wall," Melanie said, her voice carrying a mix of frustration and determination. The new fire breaks we're creating are working, but the fire's unpredictability is overwhelming our systems. It's like it adapts faster than we can. Elon stared at the screens, watching as the drones relayed data back in real time. The fire was heading toward a cluster of dry forests that had long been a ticking time bomb for wildfire. This wasn't just a local threat anymore. It was a regional disaster waiting to unfold. If they couldn't get ahead of it soon, entire towns would be consumed in a matter of hours. "We need to take a step back," Elon said after a long pause, his tone thoughtful. "We're not thinking big enough. Our current methods are based on controlling the environment, but nature is too unpredictable. We need a new approach, something more radical." Melanie and the others exchanged a look, clearly questioning what he meant. Elon had already suggested plenty of unconventional ideas, but this sounded like something even more ambitious, more risky. "What do you have in mind?" Jeremy asked. "What if we could redirect the fire itself?" Elon said slowly, as if the idea was still forming. "I mean, really control it, not just suppress it. What if we could harness its energy in some way, manage it before it spirals out of control?" The room went silent as everyone absorbed his words. It was a crazy idea, almost too radical to entertain. They'd been focusing so much on stopping the fire, trying to outsmart it with technology. But this was different. This was about not just fighting fire, but using its own power to their advantage. "Redirect the fire?" Melanie asked skeptically. "Are you saying we should fuel it? That sounds insane." "No," Elon said, shaking his head. "Not fuel it. Control it. There's a way to manage fire through fire, by understanding its behavior and creating controlled burns in areas where we can predict the outcome. I'm talking about creating a fire line, but using advanced AI to ensure that it doesn't get out of hand. We'd need to direct the fire into areas where it can burn in a controlled manner, away from the population centers." Jeremy looked unconvinced. "That's going to take a lot of precision. A single miscalculation could make things worse, not better." Elon nodded. "Exactly. We've been on the defensive this whole time, but we need to start thinking offensively. If we can manipulate the fire's movement and speed, basically, control its trajectory, we might be able to steer it away from the cities and force it to burn out in areas that are less populated, less vulnerable." It was bold. No, it was dangerous. But the more Elon thought about it, the more it seemed like the only option left. They tried fighting fire with technology, but what if the only way to win was by manipulating fire itself? "We're not just putting out a fire anymore," Elon said, his voice growing steadier as the idea took root. "We're shaping it, redirecting it. We need to think about fire like we do with rockets, using precision, control, and calculated risk. We've mastered rockets. Why not fire?" The plan was set into motion quickly. The team began analyzing data from every available source: weather patterns, wind speed, fire behavior, humidity levels, and inputting it into their predictive AI. This would allow them to not just react to the fire's movements, but anticipate them with precision. It wasn't easy. The fire was unpredictable, and nature had a way of defying the best-laid plans. But the new approach was giving them something they hadn't had before: control. The system was designed to direct the fire into pre-designated zones, burning away the dry underbrush and fuel in a controlled manner that would prevent it from spreading into more vulnerable areas. For the first time in days, Elon felt a flicker of hope. The algorithm they had developed wasn't perfect, but it was making headway. The fire started to follow the predicted path, burning in areas where it could be more easily contained, lessening its intensity in the areas they were desperately trying to protect. "This is working," Melanie said, her voice tinged with disbelief as she watched the data on her screen. "We're actually controlling it." Elon didn't allow himself to relax just yet. They had made progress, but the fire was still an unpredictable beast. One wrong move could send it spiraling back toward the populated areas, and that would be the end of everything they had worked for. The margin for error was razor thin. "We need to stay ahead of it," Elon said. "The fire's following the path we've set for it, but we can't stop here. We have to keep pushing, keep refining the system. Every decision we make from here on out has to be precise. If we make the wrong call, everything could unravel." The next several hours were a blur of calculations, adjustments, and real-time monitoring. The fire continued to shift and flare, but the AI-driven system was keeping up. They were able to steer the fire around the key areas they had been trying to protect: the reservoir, the towns, the infrastructure. It was working, but it wasn't easy. Every step forward required constant vigilance. The team worked like clockwork, constantly updating the algorithm, rerouting the fire in small, controlled bursts. It was as if they were dancing with the flames, moving just ahead of them, keeping them in check without losing control. By the time the sun began to set again, casting an eerie glow across the smoke-filled sky, the fire had slowed. The worst of it had been redirected. The damage was still extensive, but the crisis had been averted. "We did it," Melanie said, her voice full of relief. Elon allowed himself a small smile, but his mind was still racing. They had done something no one had ever thought possible: redirecting a wildfire using advanced technology. It had been risky. It had been borderline insane, but it had worked. For the first time in days, Elon allowed himself a moment to breathe. But even as the team celebrated their success, a nagging thought lingered in the back of Elon's mind. They had managed to redirect the fire for now, but the world was changing. Wildfires, floods, and other natural disasters were becoming more frequent and severe. They had won this battle, but the war against climate change, against the forces of nature, was far from over. Elon knew that this was just the beginning. The aftermath of the fire was a surreal quiet. The fire's furious roar had finally been replaced by the soft rustling of wind and the crackle of the dying embers. The scorched landscape stretched out before Elon and his team, a testament to their relentless fight, but also a stark reminder of the damage left in its wake. The smoke had cleared, but the scars of the disaster would linger for years to come. Elon stood at the edge of the burn zone, staring out over the charred earth. The temperature had dropped, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and ash. He could see the lines where the fire had been successfully redirected, areas that had once been on the brink of devastation but were now safe, thanks to their innovative strategies. The Cybertrucks had survived the battle, their modified frames and fire suppression systems holding up under extreme pressure. But there was no real sense of victory yet. They had managed to contain the blaze, but the long-term effects of the fire were just beginning to reveal themselves. Entire ecosystems had been destroyed, homes had been lost, and the human toll was still being counted. Melanie approached him, her face drawn with exhaustion but also relief. She looked over the charred landscape, her eyes narrowed in thought. "We did it," she said quietly. "We saved lives. We saved entire towns. But look at what we've lost." Elon nodded, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "I know. It's not enough to just contain the fire. We need to prevent this from happening again." The feeling of triumph was fleeting. He understood that, although they had won the battle, the war against natural disasters was far from over. There were still millions of acres of vulnerable land, homes still at risk, and countless communities whose livelihoods had been threatened. This fire was just one of many, a symbol of the larger crisis humanity was facing. "What do we do next?" Melanie asked, her voice filled with a quiet uncertainty. Elon turned to face her. "We rebuild, but not just in the traditional way. We need to think bigger. This was an unprecedented event, and we used everything we had to control it. But now, we need to build a future where we don't have to fight fire in the first place." "Are you talking about climate change?" she asked. "Yes," Elon replied. "We need to stop thinking about fire as something we can always control. We need to invest in prevention. We need to change the way we approach the environment. It's not enough to put out fires. We need to prevent them from happening at all." The team returned to their makeshift headquarters, the exhaustion from the past days weighing heavily on them. They gathered around the table, ready to assess the next steps. Elon had already begun formulating ideas for how they could turn this crisis into an opportunity for innovation, but it would require more than just technology. It would take a comprehensive approach, one that tackled the root causes of wildfires and other natural disasters. "We can't rely solely on technology to solve this," Elon said, his voice steady. "We need a larger strategy, one that combines prevention, smart infrastructure, and a new way of interacting with the environment." He looked around the table, seeing the faces of his team, many of whom had been working tirelessly alongside him for years. It was clear that the effort they had put into combating this fire had been monumental, but they were all aware that their success, while significant, was just the beginning. We've seen the power of combining AI with real-world action, Elon continued. But we can't just use technology to fight fires. We need to use it to prevent them. Think about it. Predictive AI can help us monitor and manage forest health, identify early signs of dryness, and reduce fuel loads before fires even start. Melanie, who had been quiet until now, nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. But it's not just about firefighting. We need to rethink how we build communities. What if we design cities and homes with fire prevention in mind? Buildings that are fire-resistant, landscapes that are fire breaks in themselves. That's part of it, Elon said. But we also need to go further. We need to implement massive reforestation projects, invest in smarter, sustainable farming techniques, and create fire-adaptive landscapes that can survive and even thrive in extreme conditions. Reforestation and smarter farming could also help with carbon capture, Jeremy added, looking up from his notes. That could be a game-changer for combating climate change, not just preventing fires. Elon smiled. Exactly. It's all interconnected. Our goal should be to create a balance with nature, where technology and the environment work together, not against each other. As the days passed, Elon's vision began to take shape. The immediate crisis had been handled, but now they had to think long-term. The team worked tirelessly to compile data from the fire, everything from weather patterns and wind speeds to human behavior and the land's resilience. The goal was to create a model that could predict, prevent, and control natural disasters on a global scale. They called it Project Phoenix. It was a combination of advanced technologies, sustainable practices, and community-focused innovation. The goal was not just to stop wildfires, but to prevent them from ever becoming catastrophic events again. They envisioned smart cities equipped with fire prevention systems, AI-powered drones that could monitor forests for signs of danger, and ecosystems that were self-sustaining and fire-resilient. The project was ambitious, bordering on impossible. But Elon knew that if they were going to make any progress, they would need to push the boundaries of what was possible. And if there was one thing Elon Musk had learned in his career, it was that the impossible was just a challenge waiting to be conquered. The days turned into weeks, and the team's efforts began to bear fruit. Elon reached out to governments, NGOs, and other key players in the fight against climate change, advocating for a new approach to fire prevention. The world needed a solution that wasn't just reactive but proactive, one that could prevent wildfires, floods, and other natural disasters from wreaking havoc on communities around the globe. His proposal for Project Phoenix sparked interest from international leaders. The concept of a global network of fire-resistant cities and AI-powered environmental management was captivating. It was the kind of bold, visionary thinking that Elon was known for, and he knew that it was the key to creating lasting change. The fire that had ravaged the land was now a symbol of both destruction and hope. They had fought it with everything they had, but now, it was time to use that experience to build something better. The future was uncertain, but Elon had always believed that the only way to predict the future was to create it. As the first phase of Project Phoenix kicked off, the scope of the undertaking became clearer. They began with small pilot programs, installing fire breaks, testing AI-powered systems in remote areas, and creating fire-resistant materials for buildings and infrastructure. The technology was there, but it would take time, money, and collaboration to scale it up to the level needed to make a real impact. We've made a lot of progress, but we're just scratching the surface, Melanie said as they reviewed the initial results. Elon looked at her, determination in his eyes. We've started something bigger than any of us. This is just the beginning. We're going to change how the world approaches wildfires and everything else that comes with it. As the team moved forward with their plan, they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But they had proven that, with innovation, collaboration, and a little bit of audacity, even the most impossible challenges could be met head-on. The world had changed, and so had they. But as Elon looked out over the landscape once more, he knew that their work wasn't done. The fire had tested them, pushed them to the edge, but it had also revealed something far more important: their ability to adapt, to innovate, and to fight for a future worth living in. and Elon Musk wasn't going to stop until that future was a reality. Months had passed since the devastating wildfire, and the team behind Project Phoenix had grown into a tight-knit group, each member motivated by the understanding that they were part of something much larger than any one individual effort. What had started as an innovative idea in the face of disaster was now taking shape as a global movement. But as with every bold initiative, the challenges kept coming. Far from easing, they were intensifying. Elon sat at a table surrounded by data from the latest test programs. The numbers on the screen were promising, showing that the fire-resistant infrastructure in the pilot cities was holding up well. The new AI systems for wildfire monitoring were more accurate than ever before, predicting fire-prone areas with remarkable precision. Yet, as positive as the early signs were, there was a gnawing sense of urgency. His mind was still gripped by the memory of the disaster, the relentless spread of flames that seemed unstoppable. That raw feeling of helplessness hadn't quite left him. They had made significant progress, but the scale of the challenge ahead was staggering. Wildfires weren't the only disaster on the horizon. What about floods? Droughts? Rising sea levels? The interconnected web of climate change seemed to grow more complex every day, and Elon knew that their work on Project Phoenix was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. "What's next?" Melanie asked, her voice filled with the weight of their collective responsibility. The fatigue was starting to show on her face, but her resolve remained unshaken. Elon rubbed his temples, thinking carefully. "Next, we need to scale this. We've been successful in small areas, but to truly make an impact, we need to go global. If we can reduce the number of wildfires every year, save lives, and prevent millions of dollars in damage, we could spark a global shift in how governments and businesses approach climate change mitigation." Jeremy, who had been running simulations in the background, chimed in. "It's more than just wildfires, though. If we can implement AI and climate prediction models in one area, we can adapt them to other natural disasters, flooding, hurricanes, even disease outbreaks. The tech could change the way we prepare for and respond to disasters." Elon looked up from his notes. "Exactly. We need to think beyond just wildfires. We have a unique opportunity to build a comprehensive climate resilience system. And it's not just about responding to disasters, it's about preventing them in the first place." As the weeks rolled by, the push to expand Project Phoenix grew stronger. The team traveled across the world, meeting with world leaders, environmental organizations, and tech companies to pitch their ideas. Some were skeptical, especially when the conversation veered toward the costs involved or the boldness of relying on advanced technologies like AI and drones. Others, however, recognized the potential for what Elon and his team were proposing. But it was far from easy. Elon knew that in order to create real change, they would need massive buy-in from both the public and private sectors. Governments had to see that this wasn't just a costly investment. It was a necessary one for the future of their citizens and their economies. Meanwhile, the team worked tirelessly on refining their systems, enhancing their wildfire prediction algorithms, and improving their fire-resistant building materials. They also focused on the infrastructure of smart cities that would form the foundation of Project Phoenix. These cities would use AI to regulate everything from energy consumption to waste management to water use, all with the aim of creating a more sustainable, resilient future. Elon knew that their work was not just about saving forests or buildings. It was about changing the way humanity interacted with the planet. It was about reducing the human impact on the environment and building systems that could withstand the unpredictable forces of nature. As the scope of Project Phoenix expanded, Elon found himself growing more reflective. The lessons from the wildfire crisis still weighed heavily on him. He thought back to the moment when he realized they weren't just fighting a fire, they were trying to fight a system of climate change, poor infrastructure, and human recklessness. It was a system that had been built over centuries, and undoing it would take decades of intentional action. He also thought about the personal toll the crisis had taken on him. The late nights spent staring at data, the pressure of leading a team through such uncertainty, the constant balancing act between ambition and practicality. It had been overwhelming. Yet, in the midst of it all, he had learned something profound about himself. The fire had stripped away his usual optimism, forcing him to confront the scale of the problems they were up against. But it had also shown him something deeper, that even in the darkest moments, there was hope. It wasn't always about finding a quick fix or an easy solution. Sometimes, the most profound change came from steady, calculated progress. Back at headquarters, the team had gathered for another strategy session. They had received a new round of feedback from a global climate summit that Elon had attended a few weeks ago. Some countries were eager to adopt their technology, while others were hesitant due to the cost and the scale of the implementation. Yet, the momentum was undeniable. Elon stood before the whiteboard, outlining the next steps. We need to push forward with our initial partners, countries that are already dealing with the worst of the climate crisis. Places like Australia, parts of the U.S. West Coast, and Southern Europe have seen devastating wildfires. If we can prove that our systems work there, it'll create a ripple effect. Melanie leaned forward, tapping her pen against the table. And if it works, we could start scaling this up in other disaster-prone regions. Flooding and storms in places like Southeast Asia and South America. Even the Arctic is facing challenges with thawing permafrost. The idea could have global applications. Elon smiled faintly. Exactly. It's not just about fires anymore. It's about building a new approach to how we live on this planet. One where technology works with nature, not against it. The world was starting to take notice. The media was abuzz with reports on Project Phoenix. Elon and his team had managed to capture the imagination of a global audience. People who were ready for a solution, people who were tired of seeing the same disasters strike year after year. Elon, ever the visionary, had never been afraid to propose bold ideas, but now, for the first time in a long while, it felt like people were actually listening. Despite the growing excitement, there were still significant challenges ahead. The road to large-scale adoption would be difficult. Governments had to be convinced, the infrastructure needed to be built, and the technologies had to be refined and adapted for different environments. The logistics of rolling out a global climate resilience plan were staggering, but Elon was undeterred. As the team continued to push forward, the sense of purpose and urgency had only deepened. They were no longer just responding to a wildfire crisis. They were embarking on a mission to change the future of the planet itself. As the days turned into weeks, Project Phoenix began to take on a life of its own. Elon's commitment to the cause was unshakable. But even in the midst of their progress, he knew that the journey was far from over. They had made incredible strides, but the world was still grappling with the consequences of climate change. There was still so much work to be done, but Elon had never been more certain of the path they were on. They had started something that could change the course of history, a ripple effect that would resonate for generations to come. And with every step they took, they were shaping a future where hope, resilience, and innovation triumphed over disaster. The success of Project Phoenix had created waves of excitement across the globe. There was no denying the progress the team had made, but as the months went on, Elon and his team began to see that the path forward was not as smooth as they had hoped. They were facing new challenges, some expected, others entirely unforeseen. As they began to roll out their fire prevention systems to pilot locations, they were met with significant resistance. Not from the public, who were hungry for solutions, but from industries and political powers entrenched in the old ways of doing things. There were large corporate interests tied to fossil fuels and traditional farming practices that saw Elon's initiative as a direct threat to their bottom line. Even some governments, though on the surface they had supported the project, were hesitant to commit fully due to political pressures. The challenge, it seemed, wasn't just convincing the world that technology could offer a better way to prevent disasters. It was about shifting deeply ingrained systems, some of which had been in place for hundreds of years. Elon, we need to have a conversation, Melanie said one afternoon, pacing back and forth in front of him. There's a lot of pushback on this. People are afraid of what change could mean, and there's a lot of misinformation circulating. I've been hearing the same, Elon replied, his voice calm but with a hint of frustration. Some of the media outlets are already spinning the narrative. They're calling this a tech overreach or green utopianism. The corporate interests are funding campaigns to undermine everything we're trying to do, Jeremy added, flipping through a stack of reports, and the governments that are on board. Some of them are backing out. They're worried about the short-term economic costs. They don't want to be the ones to make the initial investment. Elon leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He knew this was coming. He had anticipated some opposition, but the scale of it surprised him. The world was still deeply tied to its old systems. People were reluctant to embrace a new way of thinking, even when it was clear that those systems were no longer sustainable. "We can't let this slow us down," Elon said after a moment, his voice resolute. "We knew from the beginning that this wasn't going to be easy. But we have the data. We have the technology. We have the solution. We just need to keep pushing, no matter how hard it gets." Melanie nodded, but there was a look in her eyes that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "It's not just about pushing Elon. It's about navigating the politics. If we don't bring key stakeholders on board, if we don't get the right influencers behind us, this whole thing could fall apart." "Then we make them see the truth," Elon replied. "We take it to the people. If the governments and corporations don't want to change, then the people will force them to." It was clear to Elon that the resistance wasn't going to stop anytime soon. In fact, it was likely going to get worse before it got better. He doubled down on his efforts to garner public support, using his platform to speak out about the urgency of climate action and the need for bold, innovative solutions. He went on several high-profile talk shows, gave interviews to major newspapers, and even organized rallies in key cities. He used his public influence to cut through the noise and focus the world's attention on what was at stake: a planet on the brink of collapse due to inaction. He framed Project Phoenix not just as a technological breakthrough but as a moral imperative. The more Elon spoke out, the more people began to rally behind the cause. Climate activists, environmental groups, and even everyday citizens began to voice their support for the ambitious initiative. Social media platforms were flooded with posts demanding that governments and corporations invest in climate resilience. Slowly, the tide began to turn. People were beginning to realize that they had a stake in the future too. But even with growing public support, the team still faced resistance from powerful figures who were entrenched in old industries. In private meetings with stakeholders, Elon found himself constantly having to defend his position. "We can't just throw money at technology and hope it works," one high-ranking politician said dismissively during a meeting in Washington, D.C. "There are jobs at risk, industries that will be impacted. People depend on the old systems, and they will continue to depend on them until we build something better," Elon countered. "This isn't about replacing jobs, it's about creating new ones. We're talking about reshaping the world's infrastructure to be resilient, sustainable. We're talking about saving lives." The conversation grew tense, but Elon wasn't backing down. He knew this was part of the fight. The system had always been resistant to change, but that didn't mean change wasn't necessary. If they could prove the success of their early pilot programs, they could convince even the most hardened skeptics. Meanwhile, back at their headquarters, the team worked tirelessly to optimize their wildfire prediction systems and develop new strategies for scaling their technology. They collaborated with universities, environmental organizations, and even local governments to refine their models and ensure their approach would be effective in a variety of settings. But despite the progress, doubts lingered in the air. The obstacles were significant, and the reality of how long it would take to enact real change was becoming clearer every day. Elon couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The stakes were high, and every setback felt like a personal blow. There were times when he questioned whether they were fighting a battle they could ever win. But it was during these moments of doubt that the resilience of his team shone through. They reminded him why they had started this mission in the first place, not just to save the environment, but to show the world that innovation and progress could triumph over inertia and complacency. In a key breakthrough, Elon's team succeeded in integrating AI with predictive weather systems to create an adaptive model that could foresee potential wildfire risks months in advance. This allowed cities and municipalities to preemptively clear brush, build fire breaks, and implement evacuation plans well before fires became an immediate threat. The results of the pilot programs were staggering. Areas that had previously been devastated by wildfires saw dramatic reductions in destruction. Lives were saved, properties were spared, and ecosystems were beginning to recover more quickly than expected. But the resistance didn't end with success. In fact, it escalated. The oil and gas lobby, seeing a direct threat to their business model, began to ramp up their efforts to block legislation that would fund renewable technologies or implement environmental protections. Elon found himself not only fighting against climate change, but against the very structures that had helped create it. It became evident that Project Phoenix would require more than just technological breakthroughs. It would require a societal revolution. "We can't just wait for the system to change," Elon said one evening, pacing in his office. "We have to lead that change. We need more than just technology. We need policy, collaboration, and determination. We can't do it alone." Melanie nodded, her eyes tired but resolute. "So what's the plan?" "We push for policy change. We partner with cities and governments that are already on board. We get public support behind us, and we start building the momentum for a global climate action treaty. This is no longer just about us anymore. It's about the future of the planet." As the pressure mounted, Elon's resolve hardened. He wasn't about to back down. They were on the brink of something monumental, something that could change the course of history. But to get there, they would have to fight harder than ever before. Not just against natural disasters, but against the entrenched powers that had ignored or resisted the call for change. The team was more committed than ever. The fire was still burning, both literally and metaphorically, and they knew they had to face it head-on, together. It was a cold winter morning when the tipping point finally arrived. The momentum that had been building for months, the rallies, the speeches, the tireless work, was about to face its ultimate test. The world had reached a critical crossroads. Governments, industries, and people all stood at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Would they continue down the same, dangerous road of inaction? Or would they seize the opportunity for real change? Elon sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the gray sky. The weight of the world seemed heavier now than ever. He had led his team through fire and flood, literally and figuratively. But despite all the progress they had made with Project Phoenix, he knew that they were still far from achieving the world-changing impact they had hoped for. There were forces working against them that were powerful and relentless. The resistance from the fossil fuel industry had escalated. Behind closed doors, some of the world's most powerful leaders had been pressured into pulling back their support for Project Phoenix. One of the largest oil corporations in the world had begun a smear campaign, painting the initiative as a threat to the global economy, to jobs, to national security. Their message was clear. Technology couldn't be trusted to fix the world's most complex problems. But this time, something was different. The public response to the smear campaign had been unlike anything anyone had expected. Social media was flooded with testimonials from citizens, activists, and even former industry workers who were speaking out about the dangers of continuing with the status quo. They were demanding change, calling on governments and corporations to invest in sustainable futures. It was becoming a global movement, one that transcended national borders, economic classes, and political divides. "Elon, we've got a new challenge," Melanie said, entering the office with an air of urgency. She handed him a tablet displaying breaking news headlines. "The major fossil fuel companies are pulling out all the stops. The media's running a full-blown campaign against us now. They're questioning the feasibility of the project, spreading doubt, and promoting fear. They're accusing us of trying to reinvent the wheel. It's all over the news." Elon's mind was racing. This was the moment they had been preparing for. They had known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared them for how intense the opposition would be. "Let them talk," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We know what we're doing, and we know it's working. But now we need to go beyond just proving it to the world. We need to prove it to the people who are still on the fence. And we need to do it quickly." Melanie nodded, her face determined. "So, what's the plan?" "We make our next move undeniable," Elon replied. "It's time to launch a global initiative. We invite the world to witness what we've been doing, firsthand. No more talking. We show them." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Elon and his team prepared for the most ambitious public demonstration of their work to date. They would take their fire-resistant infrastructure systems to cities that were most vulnerable to wildfires, places like California's wildfire-prone areas, parts of Australia, and Greece. The plan was to showcase the effectiveness of their technology, the lives it had saved, and the potential for scaling it on a global level. But this was about more than just proving the effectiveness of the technology. It was about sending a message. A message that, despite the attempts to undermine the project, they were on the right side of history. The world could not afford to ignore the urgency of the climate crisis any longer. Elon worked late into the night, rehearsing his speech, refining the plan, and coordinating with local governments to set up the live demonstrations. He was also in constant communication with his team, ensuring that everything was ready for the unveiling. "This is it," Elon said to his core group of advisors, standing in front of a large map of the world that tracked their progress. "This will be the moment that changes everything." The day of the global demonstration arrived. It was broadcast live to millions of people across the world. Television stations, social media platforms, and news outlets all tuned in to see if Project Phoenix's fire-resistant technology could really make a difference. Elon stood at the center of the demonstration site in California, surrounded by the technologies they had worked so tirelessly to develop. It was a breathtaking sight: fire-resistant homes, AI-powered drones flying overhead, automated early warning systems, and climate-resilient infrastructure that could withstand the most extreme conditions. He addressed the audience, both in person and watching from around the globe. "Today, we stand at the crossroads of history. We have a choice. We can continue down the path of destruction, clinging to outdated systems that are hurting our planet, or we can embrace change. Embrace technology, resilience, and sustainability," he began, his voice calm but filled with the urgency of the moment. Project Phoenix is not just about preventing wildfires. It's about creating a world where our cities are resilient, where our communities are safe, and where the technologies we build work in harmony with the environment to safeguard the future. What we've built here is just the beginning. We have the potential to make every city, every home, and every life more resilient to the changing climate. The live demonstrations began, showing how the new technologies could withstand not just small fires, but massive, destructive ones. The drones, equipped with AI-powered detection systems, pinpointed areas at risk of wildfires and deployed fire retardants before the fire even had a chance to spread. The fire-resistant infrastructure held strong, preventing the flames from reaching the homes and businesses that had once been vulnerable. As the demonstration unfolded, it became clear that Elon and his team were on the verge of something truly transformative. The technology worked. The public saw it with their own eyes. It was no longer just a concept, it was a reality. The broadcast was a massive success. The world took notice. People took to social media to express their amazement, and news outlets began covering the demonstrations extensively. For the first time, even some of the most skeptical politicians and industry leaders began to soften their stance. It wasn't long before they received the first major endorsement from a powerful leader, a former skeptic who had been on the fence for months. The president of the European Union publicly acknowledged the success of the demonstration and pledged to implement similar technologies across member states. The ripple effect was immediate, and the tides began to shift in their favor. But even as the victory loomed, Elon knew the battle wasn't over. There was still work to be done, and the fight for global climate action was far from won. But in that moment, he allowed himself to believe that they had crossed the Rubicon. The world had seen the truth, and there was no going back. As Elon stood in the aftermath of the demonstration, surrounded by his team, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride and relief. The team had faced insurmountable odds, and yet they had persevered. They had turned their vision into something real, something that could change the course of history. But as he looked ahead, he knew that this was only the beginning. The road to a sustainable future would be long, and there would be many more obstacles along the way. Yet, for the first time in a long time, Elon Musk felt confident that change was not just possible, it was inevitable. And with that confidence, they moved forward into a new era, one where hope, innovation, and resilience would be the pillars upon which the future would be built. The energy in the air was palpable. The success of Project Phoenix's demonstration had sent shockwaves through the global community, but it was only the beginning. The true challenge lay in translating that excitement into real, lasting change. Elon stood at the helm, the weight of the world still pressing on his shoulders, but now there was a glimmer of hope that he hadn't felt before. The world was watching, and this time, the world was ready to act. In the weeks that followed the demonstration, a new kind of momentum had taken hold. Countries and cities that had once been hesitant to commit to bold climate action were now clamoring to partner with the team. Funding began pouring in, both from private investors and government initiatives. Global corporations, seeing the writing on the wall, started shifting their strategies to align with the demands for sustainability. Even environmental groups, who had once been skeptical of technology's role in solving the climate crisis, were beginning to rally behind Project Phoenix. Elon, we're seeing the ripple effect, Melanie said, her eyes wide with excitement as she scanned the incoming reports. Governments are taking action. There's new legislation being introduced. Even some of the world's biggest companies are starting to adjust their business models to accommodate sustainable technology. I know, Elon replied, a rare smile crossing his face. It's incredible, isn't it? This is what happens when people see that solutions are possible. But even as the world seemed to embrace the possibility of change, Elon knew the journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next phase would be critical, not just in deploying the technology on a global scale, but in ensuring that the systems they had built would be accessible to all, especially vulnerable communities that had long been left behind. There's no turning back now, Elon said one evening, as he and his team sat around a table, drafting the next steps. We need to be sure that this technology isn't just for the privileged few. It needs to be scalable, affordable, and adaptable. If we don't bring it to every corner of the world, then we've failed. The next phase of Project Phoenix was a massive undertaking. The scaling of their fire-resistant infrastructure and climate resilience systems to be implemented in communities worldwide. They began by focusing on areas most at risk of natural disasters, regions where wildfires, floods, and extreme weather events were becoming more frequent. The goal was not just to prevent these disasters, but to help communities recover faster when they did strike. Elon's vision expanded beyond just wildfire prevention. He began to push for a holistic approach, one that integrated sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and resilient infrastructure into every facet of urban planning. The team worked tirelessly to develop new solutions that combined these elements, from solar-powered fire breaks to smart agriculture that could withstand the harshest of climates. But the implementation process was not without its challenges. There were regulatory hurdles, local resistance, and logistical nightmares that seemed to pop up at every turn. Some communities struggled to adopt the new technologies, either due to lack of resources or political barriers. Elon's team, however, was determined to press forward, using their technological advancements to bring about real, grassroots change. Elon found himself traveling more frequently, meeting with world leaders and local governments to advocate for climate action. He spoke at the United Nations, addressing global leaders with the urgency of the situation. His speeches were met with a mix of hope and skepticism, but the fact that world leaders were finally engaging in these conversations was a victory in itself. But even as political leaders came on board, there were still powerful forces working to slow down progress. The fossil fuel industry, despite the mounting evidence that its time was running out, dug in its heels. They began lobbying harder than ever before, spreading misinformation and attempting to discredit the progress made by Project Phoenix. You can't fight them head-on, Melanie warned one evening as Elon looked over yet another round of smear campaigns from the oil and gas lobby. The more attention we give them, the stronger they become. We need to outsmart them, not just outlast them. I know, Elon replied. It's all part of the battle. But we're making progress, and the truth is on our side. The more success we have on the ground, the harder it will be for them to ignore. The battle between innovation and entrenched power had never been clearer. The technology was there, the solutions were evident, but the political and economic resistance was strong. Elon was no stranger to opposition, but this felt different. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the world was depending on them to get it right. As the months wore on, Project Phoenix began to take root in communities around the world. The systems they had developed started being implemented on a large scale. In parts of California, homes that had once been destroyed by wildfires were now protected by fire-resistant barriers and smart technology that detected fire risks in real time. In Australia, regions ravaged by bushfires began to rebuild using new, sustainable practices that would make future fires less likely to spread. But the true measure of success came in the lives that were saved. There were fewer casualties, fewer homes destroyed, and fewer communities displaced by natural disasters. These victories, though small in comparison to the global scale of the problem, were proof that change was not only possible, it was already happening. One evening, Elon stood in front of a crowd of thousands at a global climate summit, the final speech of the event. He had been through countless speeches, board meetings, and negotiations, but this moment felt different. There was a palpable sense of hope in the room, an energy that hadn't been present when he had first embarked on this journey. "We've come a long way," Elon began, his voice steady. "We've faced enormous obstacles, technological, political, and social. But every step we've taken, every challenge we've overcome, has brought us closer to the future we want to see. A future where innovation and nature work together to create a better world for everyone." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "This is not the end of our journey. This is just the beginning. The work we've done, together, is proof that we can change the course of history. But we cannot do it alone. We need everyone, every country, every community, every individual, to get involved. The only way forward is together. And together, we can create a future that is brighter, safer, and more sustainable for all." The crowd erupted into applause, a sound that Elon had not heard in such a unified way in a long time. The applause was not just for the technology or the solutions they had created. It was for the hope that they had given to the world. As Elon left the stage, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. There was still so much work to be done, so many obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that the momentum was unstoppable. Project Phoenix had become more than just a technology. It had become a global movement. And in that moment, he realized that this was the legacy he had been working toward all along. The world was changing, and it was changing because people, communities, and leaders were coming together to face the greatest challenge humanity had ever known. The fight for the future of the planet was not over, but with every step, they were getting closer to victory. What do you think the future holds for humanity in the face of climate change? Do you believe we're ready to take the next step toward a more sustainable world? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story may just inspire us all to take action. Together, we can build the future we've always dreamed of. The dawn of a new era had arrived, and with it, a future full of promise, possibility, and hope.